Tonight, we're diving into the long, gentle story of Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age, from the ordinary house where an impossible letter first arrived to the quiet years that came long after the war. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters we will follow her, without haste, through the years that made her, the books she read before she ever reached the castle, the friendships she risked everything to keep, the long wandering in the cold, the courage she carried so quietly that few ever saw its weight, and at last the calm of a life well made. You do not need to remember any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, softly, down toward sleep. Long before the world knew her name, before the great hall and the moving staircases, before the friendships that would one day carry a war upon their shoulders, there was only a girl in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, and the soft ticking of a clock in a hallway where nothing magical had ever happened. Her name was Hermione Jean Granger, and she was born on the 19th of September, in the quiet middle of an autumn that smelled of rain and turning leaves. She was, by every measure the world could offer her, a perfectly ordinary child. And yet, even in those earliest years, there was something about her that seemed to lean forward, as if she were forever listening for a sound just beyond the edge of the room. Her parents were dentists, both of them, careful and kind and fond of tidy things. They kept a practice with clean white light and gentle voices, and they came home each evening smelling faintly of mint. And they loved their only daughter with the steady, undramatic love of people who are good at their work and glad of their small, well-ordered lives. They gave her a house full of books and a garden with a low stone wall, and they gave her the quiet confidence of a child who has never once been made to doubt that she is safe. It was a happy childhood, in the way that many happy childhoods are, which is to say that it was gentle and unremarkable, and that the great strangeness waiting for her had not yet begun to knock. But she was not, even then, quite like the other children, and she knew it long before she could have said why. While her classmates traded games and secrets in the schoolyard, Hermione was most often to be found at the edge of things, with a book open on her knees and her lips moving faintly as she read. She read the way other children breathed, without effort and without pause. And she remembered nearly everything she read, and she could not always help correcting those around her when they were mistaken, which is a difficult and lonely gift for a small girl to carry. The others found her a little too eager, a little too quick with the right answer, a little too much. And so she learned, gradually and without complaint, to make her friends out of pages instead of people, and she told herself that this was enough, and mostly she believed it. Still, there were things about herself that even her books could not explain. Now and then, when she was frightened or upset, something odd would happen in the room around her. A book she wanted would slide, just slightly, closer to her hand. A cup would tremble on its saucer when no one had touched the table. Once, when a cruel word from another child had made her eyes sting, every light in the room had seemed to flicker at the very same moment, and she had felt, deep in her chest, a strange warm pressure that had no name. She did not speak of these things, not even to her parents, for she was a sensible girl who liked the world to make sense, and these small events refused to be sensible, and so she folded them quietly away and tried very hard not to think of them at all. Then came the summer she turned 11, and with it came the letter. It arrived on an ordinary morning, carried by no ordinary post, addressed to her in emerald green ink upon heavy yellowish parchment that felt like nothing her fingers had ever known. Her full name was written there, and beneath it, most astonishingly, the exact bedroom in which she slept, as though whoever had written it could see the very walls around her. She turned it over and over in her hands, and she felt her heart begin to beat in a way it never had before, quick and light and half afraid. When at last she broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter within, she read that she had been accepted to a school she had never heard of, a place called Hogwarts, a school of witchcraft and wizardry, and that she was, against all sense and all expectation, a witch. For a long moment she simply sat with the letter in her lap, quite still, the way one sits, when the whole shape of the world has shifted underneath and one is waiting to see whether it will hold. She was a girl who prided herself on knowing things, on having read the answer somewhere, and here at last was a question she could not have prepared for, an answer that had come looking for her. And yet, even through the wonder, and even through the small cold thread of fear that ran beneath it, she understood something at once. She understood that all those strange, unexplainable moments, the sliding books and the trembling cups and the flickering lights, had not been accidents at all. They had been the first quiet stirrings of a power she had carried all along without knowing its name. She was not too much. She was simply a witch, in a house of people who were not, in a world that had never had the words to tell her so. Her parents, to their lasting credit, received the news with the same steady kindness they brought to everything. They did not understand it, not truly, for how could they? But they saw the light in their daughter's face, the fierce and hungry brightness of a child who has just been told that there is a whole world of things to learn, and they trusted it. And so it was that the Grangers, a family of dentists who had never in their lives believed in magic, found themselves walking one warm day through a crack in the ordinary world into a narrow, crooked, dizzying street called Diagon Alley, where the impossible was simply sold in shops. Hermione would remember that day for the rest of her life. She would remember the cauldrons stacked in their gleaming towers, and the owls blinking down from their cages, and the strange bright coins she learned to count in that very first hour. But most of all, she would remember the bookshop, Flourish and Blots, with its shelves rising up and up like the walls of a canyon, crammed with more knowledge than she had ever dreamed a single room could hold. She wanted every book upon every shelf. She bought far more than the list required, because she could not bear to leave any of it behind, and she carried the heavy parcels close against her as though they were treasure, which, to her, they were. She was fitted for robes and given her first wand, a slender thing of vinwood, and she felt the strangeness of it hum faintly against her palm. And that night, home again in her ordinary bedroom, with the extraordinary parchment tucked beneath her pillow, she did not sleep straight away. She lay awake in the soft dark with her new books stacked upon the floor beside her, and beneath the wonder there ran a quieter current, one she would not have admitted to anyone. She was afraid. Not of magic, for magic she welcomed with her whole heart, but of the same old fear worn into a new and shining shape. She was going to a school full of children who had grown up in this world, children who had known its words and its ways since birth, and she would arrive among them as she had always arrived, the outsider, the too much, the girl who did not quite belong, and so she made herself a promise there in the dark, the sort of promise that would come to define her. She would read everything. She would learn everything. She would arrive at that castle knowing more than any child had ever needed to know. And this time, this once, she would be ready. Up next, in Chapter 2, The Girl Who Read the Whole Way to Hogwarts, we'll follow Hermione onto the Scarlet Train at platform 9 3/4 and watch a lonely, determined girl take her very first steps toward the friends who would one day become her whole world. The morning of the 1st of September came softly for Hermione Granger, the way an ordinary morning comes to any child who has slept badly out of excitement rather than fear. Her trunk had been packed and repacked, the new books arranged and rearranged, the wand from the little shop in Diagon Alley wrapped carefully among her folded robes. Her parents drove her to King's Cross Station through the gray and gentle bustle of an ordinary London day, and none of them, walking beneath the great iron arches, could quite believe where she was going. She kept the ticket in her hand, that small piece of card marked with a platform that could not exist, and she walked toward it the way she did everything, with a steady, careful courage that looked, from the outside, a great deal like certainty. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 was solid brick to every eye, and yet it was not solid at all. She had read about it, of course. She had read about nearly everything by then. And so she leaned her trolley toward the wall, and the wall let her through. And on the far side lay a scarlet steam engine, breathing white clouds into the air, with a sign above the platform that read Hogwarts Express, 11 o'clock. Owls hooted in their cages. Cats wound between the ankles of children. Steam drifted low along the ground like a warm and living fog, and Hermione stepped into it, small and neat, and already changed into her school robes, because she saw no reason to wait until she must. She found an empty compartment, and, in time, she did not stay in it. There was a boy who had lost his toad, a round and anxious boy named Neville, and Hermione, being the sort of person who could not leave a problem alone, set out along the swaying corridor to help him look. That is how she came to slide open the door of a certain compartment where two boys sat with a great heap of sweets between them. One was tall and freckled, with a smudge of dirt still on his nose and a fat gray rat asleep in his lap. The other was thin and dark-haired, with round glasses mended by tape and a curious, quiet stillness about him, and a thin scar shaped like lightning half hidden beneath his fringe. The freckled boy, whose name was Ron Weasley, had just been about to try a bit of magic. He had been given a little rhyme, a small sing-song verse meant to turn his sleeping rat a bright and cheerful yellow, and he raised his wand and recited it with great confidence. Nothing happened at all. The rat slept on, gray as ever, and Hermione, standing in the doorway with her bushy brown hair and her rather large front teeth and her bossy, eager manner, told him plainly that she did not think it was a real spell, and that she had tried a few simple spells herself, just for practice, and that all of hers had worked. She had, she explained, learned all the set books by heart already, every one of them read from cover to cover, for she had come to this world from a family with no magic in it at all, and she had wanted so badly to be ready. Then her eyes fell on the dark-haired boy and his broken glasses, and here the fussing gave way to something kinder and quicker. She lifted her wand, spoke the small charm for mending, and the tape fell away, and the glasses sat whole and clear upon his nose. It was a little thing. It was the sort of small, competent kindness she would offer 1,000 times over in the years to come, so quietly that it would rarely be thanked. She learned in that moment that the dark-haired boy was Harry Potter, and being who she was. She told him at once that she knew all about him, for she had read his name in several books, and she recited the titles as easily as breathing. Then she reminded them that they ought to change into their robes, and went off down the corridor again, and left the two boys blinking after her, not quite sure what had just swept through their compartment. The train carried them north through the long afternoon, past fields and rivers and the slow green rolling of the country, until the light grew low and gold and then blue, and the hills turned to dark shapes against a darker sky. When at last the great engine slowed and stopped, the children spilled out onto a small dark platform in the cold night air, and a voice like a rumbling barrel called for the first years to gather. It belonged to a giant of a man named Hagrid, who carried a lamp above the crowd and led them down a steep and narrow path to the edge of a great black lake, still as glass and wide as the night. A little fleet of boats waited at the water's edge, and the first years climbed in, no more than 4 to a boat, and Hermione settled among them with her hands folded in her lap and her heart beating hard beneath her calm. The boats moved off on their own across the smooth, dark water, silent, gliding, and then the castle came into view. It rose on the far cliff in a great scatter of lit windows, turret upon turret, tower upon tower, a shape out of every story she had ever loved. And for one long moment, the girl who always had something to say had nothing to say at all. She only looked, the way a child looks at a thing too large and too lovely to hold, and let the cool air move over her face and let the water carry her toward it. Inside, in the vast hall beneath a ceiling bewitched to look like the open night sky, the first years were called forward one by one to be sorted. An old and patched and pointed hat sat upon a stool, and each child in turn placed it upon their head and waited while it decided where they belonged. When Hermione's name was called, she hurried to the stool and jammed the hat down over her bushy hair, and beneath its brim she waited, tense and hopeful, in a private darkness of her own. And after a small pause, the hat made up its mind and called out the name of Gryffindor, the House of the Brave, and Hermione slipped off the stool and went to sit among the cheering table, flushed and relieved, and quietly, deeply glad. Yet the days that followed were not, at first, easy ones for her. She wanted so much to do well, and wanting it so much, she could not help but show it. In every lesson, her hand shot straight into the air before the question was fully asked. She knew the answers, all of them, and she said them, and she corrected others gently and not so gently, and she read ahead, and she reminded her classmates of the rules. And the other children, who did not yet understand her, began to call her an insufferable know-it-all, and to sigh when she raised her hand, and to leave a space around her that she pretended not to notice. Beneath the bright and busy surface of her, though, there ran a quieter thing, and it was loneliness. She had crossed into a whole new world, and she had no old friends waiting in it, no family who understood the strange and wonderful place she now walked through. She had only her books, which had always been kind to her, and her cleverness, which had always been praised, and neither one could sit beside her at supper, or laugh with her in the corridors. She hid it well. She hid it behind facts and lists and the eager lifting of her hand. But it was there, and it waited, the way such things wait, for a night that would change everything. Up next in Chapter 3, A Mountain Troll and the First Brave Lie, we'll follow Hermione into the cold stone of a Halloween evening, where tears in an empty bathroom, a great lumbering danger, and a single act of unexpected loyalty will turn two boys into the first true friends she has ever known. By the time the leaves had turned and the great lake had gone the color of slate, Hermione had settled into the castle in her own careful way. She had learned the turning of the staircases and the moods of the portraits, the shortcuts behind the tapestries, and the hour the owls came in with the post. And in every lesson she had learned, most of all, to raise her hand. Her arm would go up like a small, quick flag, and the answers would follow in a bright, unbroken stream. For she knew the incantations before the teachers had finished naming them, and she knew the uses of dragon blood and the exact way a wand must be held. Yet for all that she carried in her head, there was one small thing she had not yet learned, which was how to let a little of what she knew go quietly unsaid, and this, in the end, was the thing that led her toward one of the strangest and dearest nights of her whole first year. It began, gently enough, in the charms classroom, on a gray afternoon at the end of October. Tiny Professor Flitwick had climbed onto his stack of books to teach them the levitation charm, and had set before every pupil a single white feather to lift into the air. The trick of it, he told them, lay in the swish and the flick of the wand, and in saying the words, just so. For a witch or wizard who muddled the syllables might find rather more than a feather going wrong. Hermione followed the instructions to the letter. Beside her, Ron Weasley waved his wand and mangled the incantation, turning the soft round vowels into something clumsy and flat. And after a moment, Hermione could not help herself. She corrected him. She told him he was saying it wrongly, and then, to show him, she lifted her own feather smoothly off the desk, so that it rose and hovered high above their heads while the little professor clapped and beamed. It was the right answer, done the right way, and it won her praise. It did not win her a friend. For Ron was stung, as boys of 11 often are when they are shown up in front of the class, and as they filed out into the crowded corridor, his pride found its way into words. He said to Harry, not quietly enough, that Hermione was a nightmare, honestly, and that it was no wonder she had not got any friends. The words were meant for Harry alone. They did not stay there. Hermione was passing close behind them in the press of pupils, close enough to hear every one, and Harry knew she had heard, because she knocked into him as she pushed past, and he caught, for just a moment, the sight of her face. It was crumpled and wet. She had begun to cry. She did not come to lessons that afternoon, and no one saw her at the tea tables. Another girl mentioned, in the hushed way children pass such news, that Hermione Granger had shut herself in the girls' bathroom and would not come out, and that she had been in there crying for a very long time and only wanted to be left alone. And so the day wore on toward evening, and Hermione stayed hidden in the cold echoing room, with its long row of cracked mirrors and dripping taps, weeping over words she had not been meant to hear, while up in the great hall the rest of the school made ready for the Halloween feast. What a feast it was, or would have been. Live bats fluttered from the walls and ceiling and swooped in great low clouds over the tables, so that the candle flames in the carved pumpkins trembled and guttered, and the golden plates filled themselves with food. Yet Hermione was not there to see any of it, and Harry and Ron, seated among the others, could not quite forget the crumpled face in the corridor. They were still turning it over between them when the hall doors burst open and Professor Quirrell came sprinting up between the tables, his turban askew and terror on his face. He gasped out that there was a troll in the dungeons, a mountain troll loose in the castle, and having delivered his warning, he sank straight to the floor in a dead faint. For a moment there was uproar, and then the calm, deep voice of the headmaster brought silence down over the frightened crowd. Professor Dumbledore instructed the prefects to lead their houses back to the safety of their dormitories at once, and the teachers to go down to the dungeons after the beast. The students rose in a great obedient tide and began to stream from the hall, and it was in the middle of that shuffling, herded crowd that a single cold thought struck Harry and stopped him where he stood. Hermione did not know. She had shut herself away in the girls' bathroom with her tears and her hurt, and no one had told her, and no one was going to. She did not know there was a troll in the castle at all. So the two boys did a brave and foolish thing. They slipped sideways out of the moving line, ducked down an empty passage, and hurried against the tide toward the second floor to warn her. They had not gone far when they caught a horrible stench of old socks and unclean stone, and heard a low grunting and the heavy shuffle of enormous feet, and they hid in the shadows and watched the troll go by. It was a dreadful thing to see, 12 feet of gray lumpen flesh with a small bald head, dragging behind it a wooden club the size of a young tree. They followed it at a distance, and to their relief they saw it lumber through a doorway, and Harry darted forward and swung the door shut and turned the key in the lock. Certain they had trapped the monsters safely away, they had only a heartbeat to feel clever. Then a scream rose from beyond the door, high and terrified, and they both understood at once, with a lurch of the stomach, that the room they had just locked was the girls' bathroom, and that Hermione was inside it with the troll. They wrenched the door open again and rushed in. The troll was advancing on Hermione, who had shrunk back against the far wall beneath the shattered sinks, too frightened to run, while the great club swung and smashed the porcelain to pieces around her. What followed was clumsy and desperate and wonderful. Harry, with no plan at all, sprang up and somehow scrambled onto the troll's back and drove his wand hard up one of its nostrils, and the creature roared and flailed. Ron, white to the lips, remembered the one charm they had learned that very day. He raised his wand, and he said the words the right way at last, the way Hermione had taught him without either of them knowing what it would be for, and the swish and the flick lifted the troll's own heavy club up out of its hand, held it a moment high in the air, and dropped it straight down onto the creature's head. The troll swayed and toppled and fell full length upon the floor with a crash that shook the room, knocked out cold. Then came the grown-ups, and the danger of a different kind. Professor McGonagall swept in, followed by Snape and Quirrell, and her face when she saw the wreckage and the fallen beast was more frightening in its own way than the troll had been. She wanted to know what on earth the three of them thought they were doing. And it was here that Hermione, who had never in her life told a teacher anything but the truth, did the bravest small thing she had yet done. She stood up and said that it was her fault. She said she had gone looking for the troll herself, foolishly, because she thought she could deal with it, and that if Harry and Ron had not come to find her, she would surely be dead. It was a lie, whole and complete, and everyone in that broken room knew it, and she told it anyway, to take the blame onto her own shoulders and lift it off the two boys who had come for her. Gryffindor lost a handful of points for her supposed folly. The boys were each awarded a few for sheer nerve, and the three of them were sent away up the stairs together, in a shaky, grinning silence. There are some deeds you cannot share without coming quietly to like one another, and the felling of a mountain troll on a Halloween night is one of them. Hermione Granger walked back to Gryffindor Tower that evening with two friends at last, and she never let go of either of them again. Up next in Chapter 4, Petrified Halls and a Potion Brewed in Secret, we'll follow Hermione into a darker winter, where an unseen terror stalks the corridors and a forbidden brew simmers in a bathroom no one else dares enter. The first year had folded itself away at last, the way a long day folds quietly into evening, and Hermione Granger had gone home to the ordinary house with its ordinary garden and passed a summer among people who loved her without ever quite following where she had been. She read, as she always read, and when the warm months had worn thin and her trunk was packed once more, she returned to the castle she had come to love. She was a second year now, older by a single turning of the seasons, and no less eager than before. But the castle that autumn held a shadow in it, faint at first, like a drought felt before the open window is found. Somewhere in its deep foundations, an old story had begun to stir, a story older than any living teacher, older than the moving staircases and the silent suits of armor. It was said that Salazar Slytherin, one of the 4 great witches and wizards who had raised Hogwarts long ago, had built a hidden chamber before he left the school, and had sealed within it a monster that only his own true heir could ever wake. For 1,000 years, it had been no more than a tale, the kind repeated on dark evenings and only half believed. And then, one night, words appeared daubed upon a corridor wall, announcing that the Chamber of Secrets had been opened and warning the enemies of its heir to beware. Hermione felt the weight of those words more than most, for she was Muggle-born, a witch whose parents had never held a wand, and it was precisely such students that the old story marked for harm. Yet fear, in her, did not turn to silence. It turned, as it always did, to questions. While others whispered and looked away, she went to the one place she trusted above all others, the library, and there she began to read. She read until the tale gave up its softer edges. In a lesson of history, in that drowsy classroom where the ghostly professor droned on through the long afternoons, she gathered her courage and asked, plainly, for the truth behind the legend, and she listened harder than anyone else to the answer. She learned of the chamber, of the air, of the nameless creature said to be coiled somewhere beneath the school. It was not enough for her simply to be afraid. She wished to understand, because understanding, she had always believed, was the very beginning of being safe. Her suspicion settled, for a time, upon a single boy, a proud and unkind boy of Slytherin, whose family had long carried a taste for the old cruelties. To learn whether he might be the heir, Hermione devised a plan so bold and so patient that it might have belonged to a witch far older than she was. There was a potion, she knew, called the Polyjuice Potion, which could turn a person for a single hour into the very likeness of another. If only they could brew it, they might walk unseen among the Slytherins and ask their questions from behind borrowed faces. It was a difficult potion, one of the most difficult in all their books, and the recipe lay in a heavy volume kept behind the ropes of the restricted shelves. She found her way to it, and she read the long list of everything it required: the lacewing flies stewed for days, the leeches, the fluxweed to be gathered by the light of a full moon, the knotgrass, the powdered horn, the shredded skin of a rare and secret snake, and last of all, a small piece of whoever one wished to become. Some of these things could not be had honestly, and so, on a single crowded afternoon in the potions dungeon, while the room filled with smoke and confusion, the rarest ingredients were quietly taken from the master's private store. Hermione carried the guilt of it, but she carried the plan too, and she would not let it fall. They chose their hiding place well. On the second floor there stood a bathroom that no one ever used, an out-of-order place left to the company of a single mournful ghost. a girl who had died there long before and lingered still among the damp tiles and the dripping taps. There, over a small blue flame, in that quiet room where the steam rose and the water murmured and no living soul came to look, Hermione tended her cauldron for the better part of a month. She stirred and waited and stirred again, as patient as the moon itself, watching a mud-thick brew slowly become something finer, coaxing a near impossible thing into being with nothing but care and time. At last, on the night of Christmas, the potion was ready. 2 of her friends took the shapes of 2 heavy Slytherin boys and went off to gather what they could. Hermione had meant to become a girl of that same house and had lifted a single hair from the robe of the one she chose. But the hair had not been the girl's at all. It had belonged instead to the girl's cat, and the polyjuice potion, brewed to turn a person into a person, did not know what to do with the fur of an animal. And so, while her friends walked away in their disguises, Hermione was left behind, changed in a way she had never meant, her face grown soft with gray fur, her eyes turned yellow, whiskers upon her cheeks and a tail she could not hide. For many days afterward she kept to the hospital wing, quiet and patient still, waiting for her own true shape to return to her. It came back in time, as she had trusted it would, and she bore the whole strange trouble with a grace that asked for no pity at all. The winter deepened, and the attacks did not stop. One by one, students were found frozen in place, alive and yet still as statues, struck down by something no one could name. And through all of it, Hermione kept reading, kept turning the pages toward the answer that the whole castle needed. And she found it. Alone among the tall shelves, she came at last upon the truth of the monster in the chamber. It was a basilisk, a giant serpent, the king of serpents, whose very gaze could kill any who met it directly. She understood, too, how it had moved unseen through the school, traveling through the wide old pipes that ran within the walls. She tore the page from the book and closed her hand around it, one small word scratched in her own writing at its edge, so that the answer would not be lost. She never reached her friends with it. Walking the corridors, she and another girl had thought to guard themselves cleverly, holding a small mirror up to peer around each corner before they turned it, so that they might see the creature before ever it saw them. And in that quiet care lay both their peril and their saving. For when the basilisk came, Hermione did not meet its eyes straight on. She saw it only in the glass, a gaze reflected and softened, and so the great serpent did not kill her, but left her petrified instead, held gently in a stillness like the deepest of sleeps. They found her so, lying quiet upon a hospital bed, her face calm, the torn page still clutched fast within her fingers. For a long while no one thought to open her hand, and then, at last, her 2 friends understood that even asleep she was still teaching them, that she had solved the whole of it before ever she fell. They drew the crumpled paper gently loose, and there was the answer she had carried, the name of the monster, and the single word that told how it moved through the castle, written in her own steady hand. She had given them the key while she herself lay still, and it was that quiet gift, more than any spell, that would carry them down into the dark to bring the danger to its end. She would wake, in the end, when the spring returned and the remedy was ready, restored whole and given back to her friends, the long fear lifting from the castle like mist rising off still water. But that is a waking meant for another night. Up next in Chapter 5, Too Many Hours and a Turner of Time, we'll follow her into a 3rd year so crowded with lessons that a single ordinary day could not hold them all. and see how a small golden hourglass worn quietly upon a chain about her neck gave her more hours than any common clock could ever keep. The summer that followed those petrified halls had softened into memory by the time. Hermione Granger returned to the great stone castle for her 3rd year, and the fear that had once frozen the corridors had thinned, as fear does, into something almost like a story already told. She came back a little taller, a little surer, and carrying, as always, more books than seemed reasonable for one girl to lift. Yet this year, there was something new folded quietly into her, something she wore against her chest and spoke of to almost no one. And to understand it, we must go slowly, the way the year itself unfolded, one careful hour laid gently upon another. It began, as so many of Hermione's turns did, with a longing to learn everything at once. When the time had come to choose which subjects a 3rd year would study, most students had picked 2, perhaps 3, and left the rest aside with an easy shrug. Hermione had not shrugged. She had looked at the full list of all that Hogwarts could teach her, and she had wanted every part of it. She signed her name for the study of arithmancy, with its charts of numbers and their hidden meanings. She signed for the study of ancient runes, for the reading of old symbols carved into older stone. She signed for the care of magical creatures and for divination, and, most curious of all for a girl born to a mother and father who had never held a wand, she signed for Muggle studies, wanting to see the ordinary world she came from reflected back through wizarding eyes. Anyone who studied her new timetable would have seen at once that it could not be. There were hours in which 2 lessons, sometimes 3, were written down at exactly the same moment, in rooms far apart across the sprawling castle. No student could sit in a high tower and a deep dungeon at once, and yet Hermione arrived at every class, breathless perhaps, her bag heavy, her cheeks flushed, but always there, always ready, her hand rising into the air before the questions had finished being asked. The secret rested on a fine golden chain about her neck. Professor McGonagall, the stern and fair head of Gryffindor House, had judged Hermione worthy of a rare and delicate trust, with special permission granted by the Ministry of Magic itself, and with letters of assurance gathered from every teacher whose class she wished to take. McGonagall had given her a time turner, a tiny sparkling hourglass hung upon a slender loop of gold. A single turn of that small glass would carry the wearer back through one gentle hour of the day, so that she might live it again and be, in a manner the ordinary world could scarcely imagine, in 2 places within a single afternoon. She kept it tucked beneath her robes, warm from her skin, and she told no one what it was. When 2 lessons pressed against the same hour, she would slip quietly aside, turn the little hourglass the right number of times, and feel the world blur softly backward around her, the light sliding back across the flagstones, until she stood once more at the beginning of an hour she had already spent. Then she would hurry to the 2nd class, as though she had been nowhere else at all. It was a wondrous thing, and a heavy one, for the rules that bound it were strict and unforgiving, and she carried the weight of never being seen, of never changing what had been, of folding her days like paper and living twice inside them. But time, even borrowed time, is not without its price. Living each day stretched longer than a day was ever meant to be, Hermione grew tired in a way that went deeper than ordinary weariness. There were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there before. She seemed always to be rushing, always to be somewhere she was not, and the mountain of homework she set herself only rose higher and higher. She would not admit it, of course. When her friends wondered aloud how she managed a timetable that seemed impossible, she gave small answers and turned the talk elsewhere, and pressed on. She hid the strain the way she hid the hourglass, close and quiet and out of sight, because to Hermione the learning was worth almost any cost, and because she had never yet learned how to ask anyone to carry a part of her load. Into that crowded, tired autumn came a great ginger cat named Crookshanks, bandy-legged and squash-faced, with fur the color of marmalade and a temper all his own. Hermione had chosen him in a shop in Diagon Alley, or perhaps he had chosen her, and she loved him at once and without apology. Crookshanks, however, had taken a keen and hungry interest in a small gray creature belonging to her friend Ron Weasley, an old and ailing rat named Scabbers who had been in the family for years and who was, that year, looking thinner and more wretched with every passing week. And so a quiet quarrel wound its way through the season, patient as a drought beneath a door. Ron was certain that Hermione's cat meant to eat his rat, and grew angrier each time Crookshanks pounced or prowled too near. Hermione, weary already and stretched thin across her folded hours, defended the creature she loved and would not hear that he had done any wrong. It was not a loud quarrel at first, but it wore a groove between two friends who had faced a mountain troll and a basilisk together, and there were days when the space between them felt colder than the castle stones. Neither of them could have guessed, then, how strangely the truth of that gray rat would one day untangle itself, nor how much would come to hang upon so small and shabby a thing. There was another creature, too, who claimed Hermione's tired heart that year. In the very first lesson of care of magical creatures, taught by their great gentle friend Hagrid, the students had met a hippogriff named Buckbeak, a proud beast half horse and half eagle, who bowed only to those who bowed to him first with respect. Buckbeak had been kind to Harry, and cruel only to cruelty, for when Draco Malfoy insulted him, careless and proud, the hippogriff had struck out and wounded him. What should have ended there did not end there, for Malfoy's father was a powerful man, and soon a shadow of law fell over the innocent creature. A committee that decided the fate of dangerous beasts moved to have Buckbeak put to death, and poor Hagrid was left heartbroken. Here, tired as she was, Hermione did not turn away. She threw what strength remained to her into Hagrid's cause, burying herself in the dustiest corners of the library, searching through heavy volumes of magical law for any case, any precedent, any old and forgotten ruling that might spare the hippogriff. She wrote and copied and gathered arguments long into the night, adding this new burden to a load already past bearing, because a life depended upon it, and because she could not let a gentle thing be destroyed for a proud boy's spite. It cost her sleep she could not spare, and it drew her further still from Ron in his anger, yet she did it without complaint, quietly, the way she did most of the bravest things. There would come a day that winter when it all pressed too hard at once, when the folded hours and the endless work and the quarrels wore her so thin that the tears she had held back for months finally spilled over. Even the brightest witch of her age had limits, though she guarded them so fiercely that few ever saw, and she carried more than any of her friends knew, in silence, because that was the only way she had ever known how to carry anything. And so the third year deepened toward winter, with Hermione Granger stretched thinner than she had ever been, folding her hours, guarding her golden secret, loving a cat the world found troublesome, and fighting for a creature the law had condemned. She was tired past telling and prouder than she would ever say, and though she did not know it yet, all these threads, the turner of time, the ginger cat, the ailing rat, and the doomed and gentle hippogriff, were being drawn slowly together toward a single night when time itself would bend, and the truth would come loose at last. Up next in Chapter 6, a hippogriff, a rat, and a night that bent. We'll follow the strange and quiet hours when the day folded back upon itself, when a small gray rat proved to be something no one had dared imagine, and when one golden hourglass turned the night over gently to save 2 innocent lives at once. By the middle of that 3rd year, Hermione had learned to carry more hours than a single day was ever meant to hold. In the last chapter, we watched her turn the small golden hourglass beneath her collar and slip, quietly, out of one lesson and into another, until her nights ran thin and her eyes grew shadowed. Yet the strangest use of that little time-turner still lay ahead of her, waiting at the far end of one long and difficult night. Tonight we follow her into it slowly, the way one wades into cool and quiet water, and we let the fear in the story stay soft, because all of it passed long ago, and nothing in it can reach you now. Before that night, there was a creature to be saved, and the saving of it had already cost her a good deal of worry. Hagrid, the gentle keeper of the grounds, had a hippogriff named Buckbeak, a proud beast half eagle and half horse, and Buckbeak had wounded Draco Malfoy after the boy insulted him. The wound was small, and Malfoy's complaints were large, and so a committee of grown wizards had decided the animal must be put to death. Hermione, who could not bear an unfairness she was able to fix, spent hours she did not have buried in dusty law books, searching for precedents and copying out cases in her small, neat hand, trying to build a defense that might spare a blameless creature. She did this quietly, between all her other lessons, while her friendship with Ron had gone cold over a smaller quarrel, for Ron believed her great ginger cat, Crookshanks, had eaten his old pet rat, Scabbers, so she carried the loneliness too, along with everything else. The appeal failed, as such appeals often did, and on a gray afternoon the 3 friends walked down the sloping lawn to sit with Hagrid before the terrible hour came. Their quarrel softened in the face of it, the way small angers do when something larger stands near. On the way back up toward the castle, they found Scabbers again, alive after all, wriggling in Ron's hands, and the sight of him should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a great black dog bounding out of the dusk, a dog the size of a bear, which seized Ron by the leg and dragged him down into a gap among the roots of the whomping willow. That was a violent tree, a tree that struck at anything near it, and yet Hermione ran toward it, because Ron had been pulled beneath it, and she was not the kind to stand still while a friend was taken. Down through a low earthen tunnel they went, Harry and Hermione together, into a boarded and broken house at the tunnel's far end, the Shrieking Shack, which the whole village believed to be haunted. It was not haunted. It only held the truth, and the truth was tangled and slow to unwind. The black dog was a man, Sirius Black, the very prisoner the whole country feared, and he had not come to harm them. Then Professor Lupin arrived, breathless, and instead of fighting Sirius, he embraced him, and the room tilted toward something none of them had expected. Lupin was a werewolf, it turned out, a secret he had carried since boyhood, and he and Sirius had been dear friends of Harry's father in their school days. Hermione had guessed the werewolf part already, weeks before, having pieced it together from the phases of the moon and the mist lessons, for she noticed everything, even the things she wished were not so. The real betrayer, the one who had sold Harry's parents to Voldemort and let Sirius take the blame for it, was not in Azkaban and never had been. He was there in that shabby room, small and trembling, disguised for 12 long years as a common rat. Scabbers was a man named Peter Pettigrew, an animagus who had hidden himself in the safest small shape he could find, curled in a boy's pocket, sleeping in a boy's dormitory, while an innocent man rotted in a cell by the cold sea. When at last they forced him out of his rat's body, he stood revealed, weak and pleading, and the whole shape of the past bent into a new and truer form before their eyes. There is more that happened in the dark that followed, and we will pass through it gently. Severus Snape appeared and was knocked senseless in the confusion. Pettigrew was bound and marched up the tunnel toward the castle. But the moon rose full and clear over the grounds, and Lupin had forgotten his potion that night, and so he changed into a wild and dangerous wolf right there among them. In the chaos, Pettigrew slipped free and fled once more. Dementors, those cold-hooded guardians that fed on every happy thought, came gliding over the lake toward Harry and Sirius, and it seemed for a moment that all of it would end in the worst possible way, until a great silver light drove the darkness back. Sirius was caught all the same, carried up to a high tower room and locked there, sentenced to have his soul drawn out of him at dawn. Hermione and Harry sat below in the hospital wing, aching and defeated, believing there was nothing left that could be done. It was then that Professor Dumbledore came to them, calm as still water, and reminded Hermione, without quite saying so, of the small golden turner she wore. He told them softly that a night could be lived more than once by those who knew how, that 3 turns of the hourglass should carry them back far enough, and that many an innocent life had been saved by a little more time. Then, he left them alone with the choice. Hermione lifted the fine chain over both their heads and turned the tiny hourglass 3 times, and the hospital wing dissolved around them like breath on glass. And here the story does the strangest thing of all, the thing that gives this chapter its dreamlike name. They stood in the same evening they had already lived, 3 hours younger, and the sun had climbed back into the sky. There were now 2 of each of them abroad in the grounds, one pair moving forward toward the shrieking shack, and this other pair hidden at the edge of the forest, watching from the trees, forbidden to be seen. It was like walking through a memory that had not yet finished happening, every sound familiar before it came. Quietly, while Hagrid's hut stood empty of executioners for one more moment, they crept close and coaxed Buckbeak up onto his feet and led him away into the shadow of the trees, so that when the committee arrived to end his life, they found only an empty patch of pumpkin ground and no hippogriff at all. Then they waded through their own earlier night from the outside, seeing themselves run and fall and be afraid, learning that the great silver light by the lake, the shining stag that had driven back the Dementors, had come not from a stranger at all, but from Harry himself, standing where he now stood. When the hour was right, they flew Buckbeak up the dark side of the castle to the barred window of the tower, and set Sirius free upon his back, and watched the 2 of them rise into the night sky and away, beyond the reach of the Dementors and the cell by the sea. Through all of it, Hermione kept the count of the minutes in her tired head, steering them by the clock as surely as by the stars, because living an hour twice is a delicate and perilous thing, and she was the one who understood exactly how it must be done. Up next in Chapter 7, The Yule Ball and a Quieter Kind of Courage, will follow Hermione into a gentler kind of trial, a winter of firelight and music, and a single soft transformation of her own, and see how much bravery it can take simply to be seen. When the 3rd year at last drew to its close, and the strange bent night had folded itself quietly back into ordinary time, Hermione Granger carried home more hours than any calendar could ever account for. For the length of a whole school year, she had worn a small golden turner against her heart, slipping backward through afternoons to sit in 2 classrooms at once. And in the doing of it, she had learned that even time itself could be gentled by a careful and patient hand. That lesson settled into her the way all her lessons did, without fuss and without display, becoming one more thread in the steady person she was slowly becoming. She was 14 now, and though few had noticed it yet, the girl who read the whole way to Hogwarts had grown into someone who no longer needed to prove anything at all. The summer that followed brought its own wonder, for she was taken to see the Quidditch World Cup, a great gathering of witches and wizards from every corner of the earth beneath a sky lit with tents and lanterns. There, high above the roaring crowd, she watched a young man from Bulgaria named Viktor Krum fly, as though the air belonged to him. He was only 18, yet already famous across the wizarding world, a seeker so gifted that thousands chanted his name. Hermione watched him the way she watched most things, with quiet attention rather than open awe, and thought little more of him as the summer folded shut and the castle called her back once again. But the castle that autumn was not as she had left it. That 4th year, Hogwarts had been chosen to host the Triwizard Tournament, a contest older than 1,000 winters, in which 3 great schools of magic each sent forth a single champion to face a series of perilous tasks. From the cold north came the ship of Durmstrang, rising strangely out of the Black Lake, and from the warm south came the great powder-blue carriage of Beauxbatons, drawn across the sky by winged horses, and among the students who spilled out of that dark ship, to the astonishment of half the school, walked Viktor Krum himself, chosen as the champion of his house. The corridors filled at once with whispering admirers, with autograph seekers and sighing girls, and Hermione, who found the whole fuss rather tiresome, went on about her days as though a world-famous flyer were no more remarkable than anyone else. It was perhaps that very indifference that drew him. For as the weeks turned colder, Krum began to spend his hours in the one place at Hogwarts that Hermione loved above all others, the library. He would settle among the tall shelves with a book he was not truly reading, and watch her from a distance, too shy to cross the quiet floor between them. His gathering of admirers followed him there and giggled behind the stacks, and Hermione, faintly annoyed at the disturbance to her study, scarcely understood that she herself was the reason he had come. He was a young man who had faced dragons in the making, and yet he could not find the courage to speak a single sentence to the bushy-haired girl bent over her books. When at last he gathered himself and asked her to the ball that was to come, she was so surprised that she needed a moment to believe he meant her at all. For a ball there was to be. As Christmas drew near, the school learned that the tournament carried with it an old and glittering tradition, the Yule Ball, a night of music and dress robes held in the great hall for the champions and the older students. The younger ones fretted and paired off in a flurry of nervous invitations, and the boys of Gryffindor, Hermione's dearest friends among them, seemed to notice all at once that girls were not merely fellow students, but partners one had to gather the nerve to ask. Ron Weasley, who had known Hermione for 3 whole years, looked about the common room in a mild panic for someone to accompany him, and it did not occur to him, even once, to think of the friend who sat quietly a few feet away. When at last, near the end and short of choices, he turned to her as a kind of afterthought, he was astonished to learn that she had been asked already, and had said yes, and would be going with someone else. That the someone was Viktor Krum only made it worse in his eyes, and he accused her, unfairly, of consorting with the rival school. Hermione, stung, told him only that she had been asked weeks before, and that a girl liked to be thought of as a girl before she was needed as a last resort. The words hung between them, and something small and tender was bruised on both sides. Yet, Hermione told no one of her plans, and kept the shape of the evening a close and private thing. She had bought a set of dress robes in a soft periwinkle blue, and she guarded a small secret about her own appearance as carefully as she had once guarded the golden Turner. And so, on the night of the ball, when the great hall glittered with frost and silver, and 1,000 tiny lights hung frozen in the air, she came down the marble staircase and quietly astonished them all. Her hair, always so wild and full, had been coaxed into a sleek and elegant knot. She carried herself with an ease that made her seem, for that one evening, someone from a story. Boys who had teased her for years turned to stare without knowing whom they were staring at. Even Ron, glancing up, did not recognize her at first, and when he did, his face went slack with a feeling he could not begin to name. Hermione had not changed herself to become someone new. She had simply, for one night, let the world see plainly what had always been there beneath the ink stains and the raised hand and the endless certainty. She danced that evening on the arm of Victor Crumb, who was gentle and quiet and could never quite manage the shape of her name, wrapping it in his heavy accent until it came out soft and strange. He was kind to her and glad of her company, and for a few golden hours she was simply a girl in a beautiful hall, happy and admired and at ease. And yet the deeper courage of the night was not in the dress or the dancing at all. It was in the way she remained, through all of it, entirely herself. She spoke of her lessons and her opinions as freely as ever. She did not shrink or soften her mind to please anyone. The transformation the others gasped at was only on the surface. What mattered was that she had let herself be seen, fully and without apology, and had found that the sky did not fall. The evening did not end without its ache. Before the last of the lights had dimmed, the old quarrel with Ron flared again, and Hermione, who had held her composure through every task the day had asked of her, went at last to sit alone upon the stairs with hot tears on her cheeks. It was a small hurt, the kind that comes not from cruelty, but from being valued too late and too clumsily by someone whose regard she quietly wished for. Still, even in her weeping there was a kind of strength, for she understood something that night that many never learn at all. She knew her own worth, and she would not pretend to be less than she was to spare another his discomfort. That, more than any potion or perfect knot of hair, was the truest magic she carried down the stairs and into sleep. Up next, in Chapter 8, A Badge for the Forgotten and the Cause of the Elves, will follow her past the frost of that winter and into a fierce new tenderness as she turns her formidable heart toward the smallest and most overlooked creatures in the wizarding world. Even amid the bright swirl of that winter, when the castle had dressed itself in frost and candlelight for the Yule Ball, there was another cause that Hermione carried, quieter than any dance and far older in her heart. It had taken root earlier that same year, on a warm and terrible night at the Quidditch World Cup, when the world had seemed for a little while to come apart. In the confusion after the dark mark had been cast into the sky, when grown wizards fled and screamed and lost their heads, a small creature had been found alone among the trees, trembling, clutching a wand that was not her own. Her name was Winky, and she had once belonged to the old and cold house of Crouch. That night she was cast off from it forever, given clothes in front of a crowd, which for a house elf was the deepest shame there is. Hermione watched it happen and she was never quite able to look away again. She learned, slowly, the shape of the things she had stumbled into. She learned that house elves served wizarding families for their whole lives and asked for nothing, that they took no wages and no holidays, that they punished themselves when they thought they had done wrong, and that many of them believed, with all their hearts, that this was exactly how the world ought to be. She learned that the great feasts that appeared each night in the Hogwarts Great Hall did not appear by magic alone, but were cooked far below by more than 100 elves who lived in the warm and clattering kitchens beneath the castle, unseen, unthanked, and unpaid. For a girl who had spent her life believing that fairness was a thing you could reach, if only you were brave enough to reach for it, this was not a small discovery. It settled into her like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples of it spread all through that year. So, she did what Hermione always did when the world revealed an injustice to her. She decided to fix it. In the autumn of her 4th year, she founded a society of her own, a small and earnest thing with a long and careful name, the Society for the Promotion of Elvish Welfare. The letters of it, spoken quickly aloud, made an unfortunate little sound that set Ron laughing, though she pretended, with great dignity, not to hear him. She named herself its founder and its first president. She kept the ledger and the collection tin herself, in her own neat hand, and she gently and relentlessly recruited Harry and Ron as her earliest and most reluctant members. To join cost 2 sickles, and those 2 sickles bought a small round badge that a member was meant to wear with pride. The aims of her society were written out in full, because Hermione believed that a thing worth doing was worth writing down. In the short term, she wanted fair wages for the elves, and proper working conditions, and the simple right to be sick or to rest. In the longer term, her ambitions ran wider still. She wanted to change the very laws that bound them, and one day to see an elf take a seat in the department for the regulation and control of magical creatures, so that the creatures themselves might at last have a voice in the offices where their fate was decided. It was a grand and lonely vision for a 14-year-old to carry through a castle full of people who had never once thought to question the way things were. She carried it anyway. There were 2 elves above all who taught her both the beauty and the heartbreak of her cause. The first was Dobby, whom Harry had freed 2 years before by the oldest of tricks, a single sock tucked inside an old diary and passed, unknowing, to a cruel master. Dobby had come to Hogwarts to seek what almost no elf in the world would seek, which was paid work and freedom. The headmaster had offered him 10 galleons a week and his weekends free, and Dobby, overwhelmed and half ashamed of wanting anything at all, had bargained the offer down to 1 galleon a week and a single day of rest each month. He wore whatever clothes he could gather, mismatched socks and a tea cozy and hats piled high, and he loved his freedom fiercely, and he loved Harry more. In Dobby, Hermione saw everything she hoped for, an elf who was glad to be free, proud of his small wage, and unafraid to say what he wished. The second elf was Winky, and Winky broke her heart. Winky had come to the Hogwarts kitchens too, but she had not come gladly. Freedom, to her, was not a gift, but a disgrace. She grieved for the family that had cast her out, wept for the master who had not wanted her, and hid herself away in shame, comforting her sorrow with bottle after bottle of butterbeer, while the other elves looked on, embarrassed and afraid. Hermione tried to be kind to her, tried to tell her that she deserved better than the life she mourned, but Winky did not want to hear it, and in that small refusal lived the hardest truth of Hermione's whole cause, which was this: you cannot always free someone by handing them their freedom. For some have been taught for so long to love their chains that the loss of them feels like the loss of everything. Still, she did not stop. Hermione took up her knitting needles, and through the long evenings by the common room fire, she made woolly hats and socks in every clumsy shape, dozens of them, until her fingers ached. Then she hid them about the Gryffindor tower, tucked under crumpled parchment and left among the litter, so that an elf sweeping through in the night might pick one up by accident and be freed without ever meaning to be. It was a gentle and hopeful scheme, and it did not work at all. The elves of Hogwarts were not fooled, and they were not grateful. They were insulted, they felt tricked, and they refused, all of them, to clean the Gryffindor common room ever again, sooner than risk being freed against their will. Only Dobby kept coming, and Dobby gathered up every last hat with delight, because he thought them beautiful, and he wore as many as he could balance upon his head at once. There was something quietly heartbreaking in all of it, and something quietly magnificent too. Here was a girl fighting, with everything she had, for creatures who mostly did not want her help, in a cause her friends teased her for, wearing a badge that most of the school laughed at behind her back. She won almost nothing that she set out to win. The laws did not change that year. The elves did not thank her. Ron had only paid his 2 sickles to make her stop talking, and even Harry, who loved her dearly, could not always follow her all the way down into the depths of her fierce and stubborn sense of right. And yet she kept the ledger. She kept knitting. She kept caring for the smallest and the most forgotten, precisely because they were forgotten, and precisely because no one else would. That was the truest thing about Hermione Granger, and it slept quietly beneath all her cleverness. Her sense of justice did not need an audience, and it did not need to win to keep going. It simply burned, steady and low. For anyone the world had decided did not matter. Years later, that same tenderness would rise again, in the middle of a battle. When she would remember the elves in the kitchens and fear for their safety when no one else spared them a thought. But that was still a long way off, for now she was only a girl by a fire, needles clicking softly, making hats that no one wanted, for a cause that was right. Anyway, up next in Chapter 9, An Army Gathered in a Hidden Room, we'll uncover how that same quiet courage led her to help build something the castle had never seen before. A secret school within the school, gathered in a room that appeared only to those who truly needed it. The badge she had pinned to her robes that summer, and the gentle cause she carried for the forgotten little folk of the kitchens, went with her into a year that would ask far more of her than any that had come before. For as her 5th year opened, a new shadow settled slowly over the castle, and it wore a cardigan the color of pink sugar and a small, sweet, terrible smile. Her name was Dolores Umbridge, and she came to Hogwarts sent by the Ministry of Magic itself. She was given the post of defense against the dark arts, the subject that had already passed through so many uncertain hands, and yet she had not truly come to teach it. She had come to watch and to hold. Bit by careful bit, one decree at a time, she gathered the whole of the school into her soft pink fists. She was named High Inquisitor, and long rolls of parchment appeared upon the stone walls, each one a new rule set there in her neat round hand, each one narrowing the world a little further. She inspected the other teachers and sat in judgment upon them. And in her own classroom she took the wands from her students entirely, forbidding any true magic, and set them instead to copying from a dull and bloodless book, a theory of defense written by a man who seemed never once to have needed to defend anything at all. Hermione, who loved books more than almost anything, understood at once that this was a book meant to teach nothing. She saw what the pink woman was building. Beyond the castle, a darker thing was stirring, a return that the ministry refused to name and so pretended could not be true, and Umbridge had been sent to make certain the children of Hogwarts stayed soft and unpracticed and unprepared. The girl who had always trusted that a rule written down was a rule worth keeping now found herself facing rules made only to keep others small. And so, slowly, and after much thought, she began to imagine breaking them. The detentions were the thing that decided her. Umbridge kept a special quill in her office, a quill that needed no ink, for it wrote in the writer's own blood and carved each word into the back of the writer's own hand. Harry served hour upon hour beneath its cruelty, tracing the same lie over and over into his own skin, and he told no one for a long while, and bore it quietly. But Hermione noticed. Hermione always noticed. She saw the raw red letters healing badly on his hand, and something in her steadied and grew certain, the way still water grows clear once the ripples have passed. It was over breakfast one gray morning that she said the thing she had been turning in her mind. If no one at the castle would teach them how to truly defend themselves, then they would simply have to learn on their own, together, in secret, and the one who ought to teach them was the one among them who had faced the worst and lived. She meant Harry. He did not want the task, and he argued against himself, but Hermione had already thought it through to the end, as she thought most things, and she gently held the whole shape of it out for him to see. She chose the meeting place with care, a shabby little inn in Hogsmeade called the Hog's Head, quiet and out of the way, where curious ears were few. There, on a gray afternoon, more than 24 students gathered, drawn by whispers, unsure and hopeful, all at once. Hermione had brought a piece of parchment, and she asked each of them to write their name upon it if they wished to join. Some hesitated, for a signature was a promise, and a promise in such a year was a dangerous thing to make. But one by one, some 25 of them signed. And here the quiet cleverness that lived in Hermione showed itself, for she had not brought an ordinary piece of parchment. She had bewitched it. Anyone who signed and then betrayed the group to Umbridge or to anyone else would find the treachery written plainly and painfully upon their own face for all to see. She did not tell them so at first, thinking it kinder to let the enchantment simply be there, waiting, a silent keeper of their word. Long afterward, when one frightened girl did carry their secret to the Pink Woman, the jinx kept its promise, and the letters of the word for a sneak rose in stubborn purple across her skin and would not fade for weeks. Hermione had built loyalty into the very fibers of the page. They needed a place to meet, somewhere the High Inquisitor and her prowling helpers could never find them, and it was here that the castle itself seemed to lean down and help. There was a room, hidden away, that few ever found and none could keep. It appeared only to those who truly needed it, and it became whatever that need required, and when the need had passed it, folded quietly back into the wall as though it had never been. The room of requirement, some called it, and the come-and-go room, when the students walked past its stretch of blank stone 3 times, wishing hard for a place to learn to defend themselves, a door grew silently into being. Inside they found all they could have asked for: soft cushions along the floor, shelves of the very books Umbridge had forbidden them, and dark detectors to warn of any spy or hidden enemy drawing near. They gave themselves a name, half in jest and half in defiance, a name to prick the very ministry that feared the man they trusted most. They called themselves Dumbledore's Army. And within those hidden walls, evening after stolen evening, they learned. Harry taught them, and they practiced the spells that Umbridge would never let them so much as speak aloud, the disarming charm and the stunning spell, and in time, the guardian light of the Patronus. But it was Hermione who was the quiet architect of it all, the one who planned and organized and kept the whole delicate secret from coming apart at the seams. There remained one difficulty, and it was the one she solved most beautifully of all. How were the members to be told when the next meeting would be, without notes that could be found, or words that could be overheard? Hermione thought of the enemy for her answer. She thought of how the darkest wizard summoned his followers, a mark that burned upon their arms to call them to his side, and she took that terrible idea and turned it towards something good. She made coins, false golden galleons, one for each member. Upon each she laid a protean charm, so that all the coins were bound together as one, and when she changed the numbers along the edge of her own, the numbers along the edge of every other coin changed to match, showing the date and the hour of the next gathering, and when the message changed, each coin grew warm in its owner's pocket, a small secret heat that no one else could feel. It was magic well beyond her years, the kind studied by students far older, and those who understood such things were quietly amazed that a girl of 15 had wrought it so cleanly. But Hermione had never measured herself against her years. She had only ever measured herself against what needed to be done. And so, in a room that appeared only for those who needed it, an army learned to be brave, held together by a jinxed page and a pocket full of warm gold, guided from the shadows by the steady hand of the brightest witch among them. Up next, in Chapter 10, The Hall of Prophecy and the Cold Coils of the Brain. We'll follow that quiet courage out of the hidden room and down into the shadowed heart of the ministry itself, where a shining orb waits upon a dusty shelf, and where a night of terrible danger will test everything the young army had learned. The hidden room had emptied at last, and the bright, secret warmth of the army gathered within it settled slowly into memory, the way a fire banks down to embers that still hold their heat. The 5th year wore on toward its close, and the great examinations came, the written trials the wizarding world called the ordinary wizarding levels. Hermione moved through them as she moved through most things, with her quills laid in order and her long months of notes folded quietly into the architecture of her mind. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of the term, something had begun to lean and gather, the way a summer sky darkens long before the rain. Harry's sleep had grown troubled, and one afternoon, in the pale light of an examination hall, a vision came to him that was not a dream at all. A long dark room, and a beloved friend held there in torment. It was Hermione who tried to slow him. Where Harry saw only Sirius in danger and a door he must reach, she saw the shape of a trap laid with care. She reasoned aloud, gently and steadily, that the vision might be planted, that Voldemort might be reaching into Harry's mind to draw him toward the very place he wished him to go. She urged him to be certain before he moved, to test the dream against the waking world. It was her idea, in the end, to look for Sirius first, and her nerve that carried them into the office of the toad-faced woman who ruled the school, to reach through the green fire and learn whether the vision was true. The plan unraveled, as such plans do. They were caught and threatened, and Hermione, thinking quickly even then, spun a story that led their captor away into the shadowed trees of the forest, where the hoofbeats of angry centaurs closed the matter without a single spell of theirs being cast. And so, when there was no other road left, the 6 of them went. Harry and Ron and Hermione, and with them Ginny and Neville, and the dreamy fair-haired girl named Luna, climbed onto the backs of the great skeletal horses that most of them could not even see, the Thestrals, and were carried south through the darkening air toward London. Hermione rode blind upon a creature she could not perceive, trusting the thin warmth beneath her hands, and this too was a kind of courage, quiet and unremarked. They came down at last in the heart of the city, into a shabby telephone box that sank into the ground, and down into the deep and silent places of the Ministry of Magic, further and further, until they reached the level that few ever saw, the Department of Mysteries. The door opened onto a round black room ringed with identical doors, and when one was chosen, the whole chamber turned, slow as a wheel of dark water, so that no mark could be kept of the way they had come. Through one door lay a room where a tall glass tank stood filled with pale green liquid, and within it drifted things that turned lazily in the current, soft and coiling and strange. Brains loosed from the skulls that once had held them, adrift now in cold light. There was something dreadful in their slow turning, and something dreadful too in how quiet they were, and the friends did not linger there, though later, when the calm had broken, one of their number would be seized by those pale unspooling coils and marked by them. For now they only passed, searching, until another door gave onto the place they sought. It was a cavern of a room, vast and dim and cold, and it stretched away into shadow in rows beyond counting, high shelves rising like the aisles of some endless silent library. Upon the shelves, rank upon rank, sat small glass orbs furred with the dust of long years, and each one held a faint and inward glow, so that the whole hall shimmered like a sky of dying stars. These were the recorded prophecies, the murmured foretellings of ages, kept and labeled and forgotten. Hermione read the yellowed numbers as they walked, counting the rows in a low and careful voice, and it was her counting that brought them at last to row 97, where a single orb bore a faded label marked with Harry's own name, and the name of the Dark Lord, and a name out of long ago. He lifted it from its place, and in the lifting the trap sprang shut. Out of the darkness between the shelves the figures came, cloaked and masked, the servants of Voldemort who had waited there for this very moment, and at their head the cold pale man called Lucius Malfoy. There was no friend held captive here. There never had been. The vision had been a lure, exactly as Hermione had feared, and now the 6 children stood ringed by grown witches and wizards who meant them harm. Yet even then, she did not lose her head. She thought, and she planned, and it was her quiet word that shattered the shelves into a storm of falling glass and set them running, wands raised, through the wheeling doors. What followed was a long and breathless flight through the strange rooms of that place, spells crossing the dark like sudden birds. And in one such moment, as Hermione turned to face a tall Death Eater named Dolohov, she moved first, silencing him with a swift charm so that no incantation could pass his lips. But a curse may be cast without a voice. And his wand swept across the air in a slashing arc, and a streak of light like purple flame crossed her chest. She made a small, soft sound, no cry, only a breath let go, and she crumpled to the floor as gently as a page turning. For a long moment, her friends believed the worst. Yet she breathed. Deep and grave the hurt was, a wound that would keep her long in the care of the school nurse, and 10 different potions each day. But her heart went on, steady beneath the harm, as steady as it had always been. Even fallen, she was not wholly gone from the fight. When Neville crouched over her, she found the strength to warn him of the danger still near, pressing on his robes, guiding his hand, keeping her wits about her when her body could do so little else. This was the truth of her that the long night laid bare, that her courage was not the loud kind that charges forward, but the quiet kind that thinks clearly in the dark, that counts the rows and reads the danger, and holds fast to the people it loves even while the world comes apart. The battle would rage on beyond her, into rooms of turning time and drifting stars, into the still chamber where a tattered veil hung upon an ancient arch and grief would find them. But Hermione had done her part, and she would mend, and she would rise again. Let the peril of that night grow soft and distant now, the falling glass and the wheeling doors settling into stillness like snow upon a far and quiet field. She was hurt, but she was whole, and she was carried home. There is nothing here for you to hold. Let your breathing slow, and let the long dark hall dim gently behind your eyes, its dying stars going out one by one into a soft and dreamless black. Up next, in Chapter 11, A Bottled Prince and a Heart She Would Not Name, will follow her into a quieter year, into a borrowed book of whispered secrets, and a feeling she was not yet ready to speak aloud. The summer after the Department of Mysteries had healed the visible hurts and left the quieter ones untouched, and when Hermione Granger returned to Hogwarts for her 6th year, she carried within her a heart grown heavier than her satchel of books, though she would surely have named the books first if anyone had thought to ask. She had survived the long dark corridors beneath the ministry, the toppling shelves and the whispered prophecy, and the curse that had struck her silent across the chest, and she had come out of it changed in the way that all of them were changed that year, older behind the eyes. But there was another weight she carried now, one that had nothing to do with battles or with Death Eaters, and it was this weight, small and warm and impossible to set down, that would shape the year before her more than any spell. For Hermione had come to understand, somewhere in the tangle of that 5th year, that her feelings for Ronald Weasley had quietly outgrown the plain shape of friendship. She did not announce this to herself in so many words. She was a girl who trusted words, who had built her whole life upon them, and yet here at last was a truth she could not quite bring herself to write down, not even in the deepest privacy of her own thoughts. It lived instead in the small things. It lived in the way her attention drifted toward him across the common room, in the particular sting of his careless remarks, in the odd aching gladness she felt when he was simply near. She told herself it was nothing worth minding, told herself a great many sensible things, and all the while the feeling only deepened, patient and unhurried, the way water finds its level in the dark. The 6th year brought a new master to the dungeons. The round and genial Horace Slughorn, who had a fondness for gathering promising students about him as a collector, gathers bright coins. He noticed Hermione at once, for her brilliance was quite impossible not to notice, and he welcomed her warmly into the little circle he liked to keep. Yet the very same term that opened such doors for her closed another she cared about far more, for it was in Slughorn's potions class that Harry came into possession of an old and battered textbook, its margins crowded with the cramped handwriting of a previous owner who had signed himself only as the Half-Blood Prince. Harry, following the prince's scribbled shortcuts, began to shine in potions as he never had before, brewing with a sudden and effortless skill that plucked fresh praise from Slughorn at every single lesson. And where most of the others saw only good fortune, Hermione saw something that troubled her deeply. She did not like the book. She did not like that its cleverness came from a hand no one could name. that Harry leaned so happily upon instructions he did not truly understand, taking a credit that was not wholly his own. She worried, in the honest and tireless way she always worried, that a source unknown might carry within it a danger unseen, and she spent long hours in the library searching for any record of who this prince might have been, and found nothing at all. Her unease was not jealousy alone, though there was a thin thread of that woven through it too, for she had always been the finest brewer among the three of them. It was something closer to fear, the soft dread of a girl who trusts knowledge above almost everything and mistrusts, on principle, anything that arrives without a name attached. But the year's deepest ache lay elsewhere, and it began, of all the unlikely places, upon the Quidditch pitch. When the trials were held for the Gryffindor team, Ron stood among those hoping to keep goal, pale and trembling with nerves, and a boastful older boy named Cormac McLaggen seemed all but certain to take the place from him. And so Hermione, watching from the stands with her heart lodged high in her throat, did a small and secret thing that she would never afterward quite bring herself to admit aloud. As McLaggen flew to defend the final hoop, she raised her wand beneath the cover of her sleeve and sent a confundus charm drifting toward him, so that he swayed the wrong way and missed. And the place went to Ron after all. It was not a thing the rulebook would ever have forgiven, and it was entirely unlike the girl the world believed her to be, and yet it told the truth of her heart more plainly than any confession could have. For a little while, there was happiness. Ron kept his hard-won place and grew steadier in his confidence, and after a match well played, the Gryffindor common room filled with warmth and noise and celebration. But happiness, that year, was a fragile and short-lived thing. For in the very midst of the cheering, Hermione turned and saw Ron with his arms wound tightly about Lavender Brown, the two of them kissing without the least care for who might be watching, and something quiet inside her went softly and completely to pieces. She did not weep in front of them. She gathered up what remained of her composure and slipped away to an empty classroom, and there, alone in the dim, she at last let the hurt come. Earlier that very day, in Charms, she had conjured a flock of small, bright yellow birds, a pretty and delicate piece of magic that had twittered about her head like a living crown. Now, when Harry found her sitting among the deserted desks, and the door opened again to admit Ron and Lavender still tangled together, the sweet little birds she had made became something else entirely. With one fierce and wordless motion, Hermione sent the whole flock hurtling at Ron, like a shower of fat golden bullets, and they pelted him about the head and arms before bursting away into nothing, and she fled the room before he could ever see the tears she had held back for so long. The weeks that followed were among the loneliest of her whole school life. Ron and Lavender became a fixture of the corridors, forever murmuring in corners, and Hermione taught herself to look steadily elsewhere, to bury her face a little deeper in her books, to speak briskly and smile thinly and give away nothing at all. Yet the effort of it wore at her more than she let anyone see, for it is a tiring thing to guard a feeling day and night, and lonelier still to guard it against the very person it belongs to. Then came Slughorn's grand Christmas party, all candlelight and crimson hangings and the low hum of important guests. Hermione arrived upon the arm of Cormac McLaggen, and she confided to Harry, in a low and rueful voice, that she had asked Cormac for one reason only, because she knew that of all the boys in the school, his company would annoy Ron the most. It was not a kind admission, and she knew it, and she wore it like a small stone in her shoe. Yet her clever little plan had turned upon her almost at once, for McLaggen proved altogether unbearable, boastful and grasping, and forever trying to corner her beneath the mistletoe, so that she spent the better part of the evening ducking behind curtains and slipping among clusters of guests to keep out of his reach. Somewhere in that hiding, she grew quiet and told Harry that she rather wished she had simply come with a friend instead, and in those few tired words lived the whole of the heart she would not name. For that was the truest thing about Hermione Granger in her 16th year. She endured. She carried a love she had not chosen and could not speak, and she did not let it make her cruel, nor bitter, nor careless of her friends. She went on studying, went on worrying over Harry and his dangerous borrowed book, went on being, quietly and stubbornly, the steadiest of the three. The heart she would not name aloud she carried instead in silence, folded small and kept close, the way she had once folded away all the strange unexplainable things of her childhood, trusting that in time the world would make its sense again, and slowly, through all the small hurts of that long and tender year, it did. Up next in Chapter 12, Three Friends, a Tent, and the Long Wandering, we'll follow Hermione out of the safety of the castle at last, into a world at war, and watch her pack a small beaded bag with everything three fugitives might need for the hardest and longest journey of their young lives. When the summer came at last, it came without a school to return to, and this, more than anything, was how Hermione Granger understood that her childhood was truly over. The tower where the headmaster had fallen stood silent now, and the white tomb by the lake gleamed beneath the sun, and the great castle that had been her second home for 6 long years lay empty of the one man who had seemed, to all of them, to hold the whole of the danger back by the simple fact of his being alive. She had wept quietly at his funeral, the way she did most things, and she had held to the sleeve of her friend as the golden flames rose, and somewhere within that grief a decision had already begun to harden inside her, cool and clear as glass. For she knew what Harry meant to do. She had known it before he ever said it aloud, the way she so often knew things a little ahead of the rest. He would not be going back to school. He would go instead into the wide and dangerous dark to hunt the scattered pieces of a soul that had to be destroyed before the world could be made whole again. And she and Ron would go beside him because there had never once been a question of anything else. The three of them had faced a mountain troll together when they were only 11 years old, and every year since had bound them tighter, and now, at the very end of everything they had known, they would not be parted. The hardest of all the things she did that summer, she did entirely alone, and she told no one until it was finished. In the small tidy house where she had grown up, among the clean white light and the faint smell of mint, her mother and father went about their ordinary evenings, wholly unaware of the shadow that had fallen across the world beyond their garden wall. And Hermione, who loved them with the fierce and guarded love of an only child, understood with terrible clarity that this shadow would come looking for her, and that when it did, it would find them first. She was the softest place the enemy could reach, the family of a Muggle-born girl who had made herself a friend of the boy who lived. So she made a choice that no child should ever have to make, and she made it without flinching, which was perhaps the bravest thing she ever did. She lifted her wand in the sitting room of her own home, and with great care and far greater sorrow, she reached into the minds of the two people who had loved her longest, and she gently took herself out of them. In the place where she had been, she wove a whole new life. She gave them new names, Wendell and Monica Wilkins, and a new and shining dream that they had always longed, more than anything in the world, to leave England behind and begin again in Australia. They would sell the house. they would go, and they would carry with them no memory at all of the daughter who smiled from every photograph on the walls. The daughter who now stood watching her own face fade quietly from each frame, one by one, until the home she had known held no trace of her at all. It was the surest way to keep them safe, and she knew it, and knowing it did not make it hurt any less. When it was done, she walked out of that house a stranger to the people inside it, and she did not let herself cry until she was well away down the street, and even then she cried softly, for she had already learned that the strongest kind of love is often the kind that asks nothing back and lets itself be forgotten. Then, into a small beaded handbag, no larger than her two joined hands, she set about packing a war. She had laid upon it an undetectable extension charm, so that its modest embroidered mouth opened onto a space with no bottom and no end, and into that endless space she folded everything 3 fugitives might need for a journey with no map and no home. Clothes for each of them, though poor Ron's would never quite fit. Books, of course, always books. Dozens of them, the histories and the reference volumes, and a tattered old copy of tales that would one day come to matter more than any of them could guess. Potions and phials and the small, kind essences of things that healed. A tent. Provisions enough to last. Even a portrait she would come to need. She had thought of nearly everything, because thinking of everything had always been the shape her love took, and now, at the end of the world, that patient habit of preparation became a kind of shield she carried for them all. The last bright thing before the long dark was a wedding. At the crooked, comfortable house called the Burrow, beneath a great white marquee raised among the trees of the orchard, Bill Weasley married Fleur Delacour on a golden afternoon at the beginning of August, and for a few gentle hours the war seemed very far away. There was music, and there were flowers, and there was dancing on the warm grass, and Hermione, in a floating dress of lilac, let herself for one small while be simply a young woman among friends, glad and quietly sad and 17 years old. It was the sort of afternoon one folds away with care to keep, because some part of her surely knew it would have to last a very long time. And then, into the middle of the music and the light, there fell a great silver lynx. It came down from the sky and landed lightly among the astonished guests, glowing, and it spoke with the deep and steady voice of Kingsley Shacklebolt, and the message it carried stopped every heart beneath the marquee. The Ministry of Magic had fallen. The minister himself was dead. The enemy was coming, and they were coming now. What followed was not so much a moment as a scattering. Guests cried out and vanished into the air, the protective enchantments about the Burrow beginning to fail around them. And in the very heart of it all, Hermione Granger did the thing she had spent the whole long summer quietly preparing herself to do. She seized Harry's hand, and she seized Ron's, the beaded bag already clutched tight against her, and she turned on the spot and pulled the 3 of them out of the light and the danger, and into the crushing dark of disapparition, away from the wedding, away from the very last safe place that any of them had. They came down upon a busy street in the heart of Muggle London, Tottenham Court Road, blinking in the sudden roar of it. Even there the Death Eaters found them, in a small late caff, and there was a flash of curses among the tables before Hermione's quick and certain wand set the danger down and wiped the memory of it clean away. From there they fled to the old dark house at number 12, Grimmauld Place, and from there, at last, into the long wandering that would swallow the whole of the year to come. For that was how their war would be fought, not in one great battle, but in a slow and homeless drifting from place to place. A tent pitched at dusk in a wood, or upon a moor, or in some lonely windswept field, and struck again at first light before the day could give them away. And each night, wherever they stopped, Hermione walked a wide and careful circle around their small canvas home and laid her enchantments over it like a mother tucking a blanket round a sleeping child. Charms against the eyes of enemies, against the ears of listeners, against the wandering feet of any muggle who might stray too near. She murmured the old protective words into the cold air until the little camp sat wrapped in silence and safety, and only then would she allow herself to rest. She was often tired and often frightened, and she was very far now from any home she had ever known, and still, night after night, it was her quiet, unshowy strength that kept the darkness standing at the door. Yet the safety she wove so faithfully around them each evening could not reach inside the tent, where a small and heavy thing hung upon a chain against her friends' chests, cold and patient and cruel, and where, among the three who had never once been parted, an empty place had already begun to form. Up next in Chapter 13, The Locket's Weight and the Empty Chair, we'll follow Hermione deeper into the long winter of the hunt and feel how a single dark and whispering trinket, worn turn by turn against the heart, could sour even the oldest of friendships and hollow out a chair that one of them would leave standing empty behind him. The wandering did not end so much as it deepened, one gray country giving way to the next, and the little tent came down and went up again in valleys and on windswept hills and along the reeded banks of rivers whose names the three of them never learned. They had by then a single terrible thing among their belongings that could not be left behind and could not yet be destroyed, and so they had made a rule of it, quiet and unspoken. The way tired people make rules. Salazar Slytherin's locket, that heavy golden thing with the coiled serpent worked upon its face, was worn against the skin in turns, a day for one and then a day for the next, so that no single one of them should carry its weight alone. It hung on a chain about the neck, small enough to close in a fist, and heavier by far than any object so small had a right to be, for it was not truly an ornament at all, but a piece of a soul, and the soul inside it was the most damaged soul in all the world. When it lay against the heart, it seemed to listen there, and to answer, and what it answered with was cold. The wearer would feel it first as a dropping of the spirits, a dimming, as though a cloud had passed across some inward sun and would not move on. Then the small mean thoughts would come, the ones that live in everyone and are usually kept in their proper cupboards, and the locket would draw them out and hold them up to the light and make them seem like truth. It fed on hunger and on tiredness and on fear, and the three of them had a great deal of all three, and so it grew fat on them through that long and starving autumn. Hermione felt it as a kind of gray exhaustion when it was her turn, a sense that nothing they did would matter, and that they had already, somehow, lost. But of the three of them it pressed hardest upon Ron, and she saw it pressing and could not lift it from him. He was hungry in a way that gnawed, for the food they could steal or gather was never enough, and he worried for his family with a worry that had no rest in it. Each evening they turned the small wireless dial, listening through the crackle for the roll of names, the taken and the missing and the dead, and each evening Ron listened hardest of all, waiting to hear a name he loved and dreading to hear it. And the locket sat upon his chest through all of it and whispered that the worst was already so. The night it broke had rain in it, a thin and steady rain that ran down the canvas and pooled in the trodden grass, and Ron had worn the locket the whole of that long gray day. He came back into the tent cold and wet and empty-handed, and the small warmth of the place did nothing to reach him, and the thing about his neck had by then said everything unkind it knew. What began as weariness curdled into anger, and the anger found its edges, and words that had waited a long while came out of him all at once. He said that they were getting nowhere, that there was no plan, and never had been, that Harry had led them into the wild with nothing but a guess, and that people were dying while the three of them starved in a field. And Hermione stood between the two boys she loved best in the world, her hands lifted a little, trying with her voice to gentle it, to remind them that they were tired, that the locket was upon him, that none of this was truly his own heart speaking. But he would not be gentled, and he turned to her, and he asked her the one question she could not soften, which was whose side she meant to stand on. She told him the truth, quietly, that she was with Harry, that they had both of them promised to see this through beside their friend, and that she meant to keep her promise. She did not say it to wound him, she said it because it was so, and because in all the years of her life she had never yet learned how to say a thing that was not so. And she watched the words land on him, and she watched something in his face close like a door. He pulled the locket over his head then and cast it into a chair, and he told them he had had enough, and he went out through the flap of the tent into the dark and the rain. Hermione cried out his name and went after him, out into the cold and the wet, with her hair falling into her eyes, calling for him across the streaming grass, and the night gave her back nothing at all. There was a turning in the air, a sound like the world folding once upon itself, and then he was gone, disapparated into the vast wet dark, and no amount of calling would bring him back through it. She stood a moment longer in the rain, because the heart is slow to believe a thing the mind already knows, and then she came back inside. She came back soaked to the skin and shaking, and she was weeping in the way that has no drama in it, only a helpless, steady spilling, and she sank down onto the floor of the tent and drew her knees up small. Across from her stood the chair, and in the chair lay the locket where he had thrown it, and beside the chair was the place where he was not. That was the cruelest thing of all in the nights that followed, the plainness of it. The empty chair that had held a friend an hour before, and held only shadow now. Harry did not know what to say to her, for there was nothing to say, and so he did the only thing there was, which was to take up the locket himself and hang it once more about his own neck, so that at least she need not carry that as well. And Hermione lay down at last and cried herself into a thin and broken sleep, and the rain went on against the canvas all the night. The grief did not leave with the morning. It settled into her the way cold settles into stone, quiet and deep and slow to warm. In the days that came, she spoke little, and she wept when she thought Harry could not see, and sometimes when she could not help it, where he plainly could. Each evening she still turned the wireless dial and listened for the names, but now she listened for one name above all others, waiting in a fresh and private terror to hear that a red-haired boy had been found somewhere cold, and each evening the name did not come, and that was its own small, unbearable mercy. She kept the tent in order. She kept the wards raised against the dark outside. She held the two of them together with a will that had grown very tired and would not yet let go. And in the depth of that sorrow she made a choice, though she never spoke of it as a choice, for to her it was only the shape of who she was. She might have gone, There were nights, surely, when the going would have been easier than the staying, when the field was cold and the food was gone, and the boy she loved had walked out into the rain and not come back. But she had promised, and more than promised, she had chosen long ago, in a swaying train and an empty bathroom, and 100 quieter moments since, that she would not leave Harry Potter to walk his road alone. So she stayed. She wiped her eyes and she folded away her fear as best she could, and when he was ready to move on, she took down the tent and took up her wand and went on with him. 2 friends now where there had been 3, into a winter that was only beginning. Up next in Chapter 14, Godric's Hollow and the Serpent in the Snow, we'll follow Hermione into a village hushed under Christmas snow, past a monument that remembers a lost family and a churchyard full of old graves, to a quiet house where an old woman waits, and where a thing that is not a woman at all lies coiled and patient in the dark. The winter had grown very deep by the time the 2 of them turned their thoughts toward Godric's Hollow. There were only 2 of them now, for the freckled boy had gone, and his empty place at the little folding table was a quiet ache that neither of them spoke of aloud. Hermione carried on as she always did, tending the small blue flames, keeping the long watch through the frozen nights, and if her eyes were often red in the mornings, she let no one see her weep, because there was no one left to see. And so, with the locket's cold weight passing between them and the days shortening toward Christmas, she agreed at last that they should go to the village where Harry had been born, and where his mother and his father lay buried beneath the snow. They went on Christmas Eve, hidden together beneath the old invisibility cloak, holding hands as they turned upon the spot, and let the darkness pull them from one place into another. When the world settled again, they stood in a narrow lane at the edge of a small and sleeping village, and it was snowing, softly and steadily, the flakes drifting down through the yellow light of the lamps and settling upon their hair. Somewhere ahead a little church was lit warmly from within, and the voices of a choir came out across the cold air, carols rising and falling, and the graves in the churchyard beside it wore soft white caps of snow. For a while, the 2 of them simply stood in the lane and listened, 2 figures that no one could see, breathing out little clouds into the deepening dark. In the middle of the village stood a stone monument, an old war memorial such as any ordinary village might keep. And yet as they drew near to it, the gray stone seemed to shift and change before their eyes. Where there had been a plain obelisk there, now stood the figures of 3 people. A man with untidy hair and round glasses, a woman with long hair and a gentle face, and a baby boy held safe in her arms, and the snow fell upon their carved shoulders as though it did not know they were only a memory. Hermione looked up at the little family in stone and said nothing at all, because there are moments too large for any saying, and she only let Harry look at them for as long as his heart required. Then they passed through the small gate into the churchyard and moved among the leaning stones with their wands lit low. They found the resting place of Dumbledore's own mother and his young sister, Kendra and Ariana, a discovery that startled Hermione, who had never known the old headmaster had once called this quiet place his home. They found another stone, very old and worn nearly smooth, and marked upon it a strange sign, a triangle that held a circle and a single upright line, the same odd symbol they had glimpsed before and could not yet explain. And then, near the far edge of the churchyard, half hidden under snow, they came upon the white marble grave they had crossed the whole winter to find. 2 beloved names were carved into it, and beneath the names ran a single line, that the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And Harry knelt down before it in the snow and could not speak a word. Hermione stood a little apart from him, letting him keep his grief close and private, and then, because she could not bear to leave the grave so bare on such a night, she lifted her wand and conjured out of the empty winter air a wreath of Christmas roses, white and perfect, and laid it gently at the foot of the stone. It was the smallest of kindnesses and the very largest, the sort of quiet thing she had always done and would always do, and the snow came drifting down over the pale flowers while the two of them turned at last to go. They walked back through the hushed village, and along the way they came upon a house that was not like the others, a house half fallen into ruin behind an overgrown hedge, its upper floor blown clean away. The dark broken hole in its side, left just as it had been on the night the whole world had shattered for a baby boy. A sign rose up out of the snow-buried garden as they stood there, golden letters telling whose home this had once been. And across it, scrawled by the hands of countless strangers across the long years, ran small messages of love and hope for the boy who had lived. Hermione read them quietly and slipped her cold hand into his, and it was then, standing before that gentle ruin, that they slowly became aware they were not alone. An old woman stood a little way off in the falling snow, wrapped and muffled thickly against the cold, watching them without a single word. She was very old and bent, and her face was hidden deep in her shawls. And something in Harry believed he knew her, for this was the village where the great and ancient historian Bathilda Bagshot had lived out her long and scholarly years. The woman beckoned to them with one slow-gloved hand, and though Hermione felt a creeping unease she could not put a name to, they followed the stooped figure through the snow to a dark and narrow little house, and stepped gratefully inside, out of the biting cold. The house was close and dim and heavy with the smell of age, and something fouler waiting beneath it, and the old woman would not speak at all, and would only gesture that Harry should climb the stairs with her alone. Hermione's unease grew and grew, and she was right to feel it, for the woman who had led them there was not truly a woman at all. Bathilda Bagshot had been dead for a long while, and the thing that wore her shape was no historian, but a great and terrible serpent. Nagini, the beloved creature of the Dark Lord himself, coiled and patient inside a hollow, ruined body, set there to wait for the boy who everyone had known would one day come home to the place of his birth. Upstairs, the trap sprang shut. The old shape split and burst apart, and the enormous snake struck out from within it, and Harry's scar tore open with a white blaze of pain, and the creature wound itself about him, crushing and thrashing, smashing the small dark room to splinters. And Hermione, hearing the crash from below, did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. She came flying up the narrow stairs with her wand already raised, and into that ruin of breaking wood and coiling scales she flung her spells, curse after bright curse, blasting the great snake back from her friend and dragging him free by sheer strength, and her plain refusal to lose him too. In all that roaring chaos and flying light, one of her own curses struck the wall and rebounded, and in the blindness of that terrible moment it fell upon the wand clutched in Harry's hand, the wand of holly and phoenix feather that had chosen him when he was only 11 years old, and it broke the slender thing nearly in two, so that it hung together now by a single fragile thread. She did not know it yet. There was no time in the world to know anything, for the very air had begun to burn with the coming of something far worse than the snake, a cold and rushing arrival out of the night, the Dark Lord himself flying home to the place where his creature had sprung its patient trap. Hermione seized Harry hard about the chest, and with the snow driving in through the shattered window and the whole house shuddering upon its foundations, she turned upon the spot and pulled the two of them clean out of the world and away. They fell out of the darkness onto a cold and empty hillside far from the village, and the snow was falling there too, soft and endless and merciful, and Harry sank down insensible with the fever of his scar heavy upon him. Hermione, shaking still, laid him gently down and raised the little tent above them and cast about the two of them every charm of protection and concealment that she knew, so that no eye and no ear in all the dark could ever find them in the white and silent night. Only when they were safe, when the small fire was lit and her friend lay breathing quietly beneath his blankets, did she draw out the broken wand and understand at last what had happened in that room, and grief and guilt settled slow over her heart like the falling of the snow. She had saved his life this night. She had also broken the very thing that had defended it, and she would carry that quiet, aching sorrow with her through all the cold and wandering days still to come. Up next in Chapter 15, the word carved into her arm will follow Hermione out of the long white wandering and into the hands of those who hate her most, where a cruel woman with a silver knife will seek to teach her, in blood and in pain, that a girl born of ordinary parents has no place in their bright and ancient world, and where Hermione will discover just how much cruelty her gentle and unbending courage can be made to endure. After the cold and narrow escape from Godric's Hollow, where a serpent had worn the shape of an old woman and Harry's wand had broken in the dark, the three friends did not stay still for long. Ron had come back to them by then. He had returned through the deep snow with a grief he could hardly speak and a loyalty that spoke for him instead, and in a frozen and silent wood he had drawn the sword of Gryffindor from a black pool of ice and brought it down upon the locket until the dark thing sleeping inside it cried out and was gone. So they were three again, as they had always been meant to be, and the sword of Gryffindor traveled with them now, wrapped and hidden among their few belongings, a bright and secret weight that neither the enemy nor the world was supposed to know they carried. They moved from one lonely place to another, pitching the enchanted tent in the shelter of bare trees and folding it away again before the light grew strong. They were tired in a way that sleep could not mend, thin and cold, and worn down to the quiet endurance that had carried them all this long year. And it was in this weary state, one gray afternoon, that a single careless thing undid them. A name was spoken aloud that was never meant to be spoken, the name of the darkest wizard of the age, for a curse had been laid upon that name so that whoever dared to say it would be found. The speaking of it tore a small hole in the charms that hid them, and through that hole, almost at once, came the sound of rough voices and heavy feet. They were Snatchers, a ragged band of men who hunted down the hunted for gold, and they closed in through the trees before the three could gather themselves and flee. In that first breathless moment, Hermione did the cleverest and bravest thing that could be done. Knowing that Harry's face was the most wanted face in all the world, she raised her wand and struck him with a stinging jinx, so that his features swelled and blurred and puffed until even his closest friend might not have named him. It was a small unkindness done out of great love, a wound given to hide a wound, and it was the sort of quick and selfless thinking that had saved the three of them more times than any of them could count. But the trees were full of enemies now, and cleverness alone could not carry them clear. They were seized, all three, and their wands were taken, and the ragged men crowed over their catch. The Snatchers went through the friends' belongings with greedy hands, and among the tangled cloth and the small worn things they found the sword. They did not understand what it was. To them it was only a fine blade, a pretty treasure to be argued over. But they had also found, in Hermione's care, other clues to who these prisoners might be, and slowly a terrible suspicion grew among them that the swollen, unrecognizable boy might be the very one they had been told to look for. And so, rather than settle the matter in the cold woods, the leaders of the band made their choice. They would carry the three of them to a place where a far crueler judgment waited. They would bring them to Malfoy Manor. The manor rose behind tall iron gates, dark and grand and silent, a beautiful house grown cold at its heart because of the people who now sheltered within it. The three friends were dragged through its wide doors and into a long drawing room, and there, in that hushed and gilded place, the danger sharpened to a fine and dreadful point. The pale Malfoy family stood among the shadows, and the boy Draco, who had known Harry for years, was called forward and made to look at the swollen face and say whether it was truly him. He looked for a long moment. Something in him faltered. He would not say the name for certain, and in his hesitation there lived a small, frightened mercy that even he did not seem to understand. Yet the sword had come into that house with them, and the sword was what broke the fragile quiet apart. For among the dark witches and wizards gathered, there was one whose madness ran deeper than all the rest. A woman named Bellatrix Lestrange, black-haired and hollow-eyed and terrible, who had given her whole ruined soul to the service of the dark. When her gaze fell upon that bright blade, a cold horror seized her, for she believed the sword of Gryffindor to be locked safe and deep within her own vault at the Wizard's Bank. If these ragged children carried it here, then they had been where no one was meant to go. They had touched what no one was meant to touch, and the secret she guarded for her master might already be undone. Her fear turned at once, as fear so often does in cruel hearts, into rage. She would have the truth from them, and she would have it now. The two boys were sent down into the darkness of the cellar below, where other prisoners already sat in the cold, and Hermione alone was kept above, in the long bright room, to answer for the sword. What followed was the hardest hour of her young life, and it is enough, on a quiet night such as this, to speak of it gently and from a little distance, the way one draws a soft blanket over something that should not be looked at too closely. The Mad Witch used a curse that brings pain without wound, a curse that fills the body with fire and leaves no mark to show for it. And she asked again and again how three children had come to hold the sword, and whether they had broken into her vault, and what else they might have taken from it. And through all of it, Hermione did not break. This is the thing worth remembering as the dark gathers and the world goes still. She was frightened, more frightened than she had ever been, and she was in more pain than a person should ever be asked to bear, and yet the clear and steady mind that had carried her since she was a small girl reading by lamplight did not desert her. She held to a lie, and she held to it perfectly. She said the sword was a copy, a worthless fake, that they had never been near any vault, and she said it so well, again and again beneath that terrible questioning, that in the end a captive goblin brought up from the cellar was made to look at the blade and confirm that it was false. It was not false, but her steadiness had made it seem so, and in that lie she shielded her friends, and she shielded a far greater secret than any of them yet fully understood. Before the cruel witch was done, she took a small knife, and, in a fit of hatred as old and ugly as anything in that world, carved a single word into the soft skin of Hermione's forearm. It was the word mudblood, the vile old slur flung at those born to parents without magic. The word meant to say that such a person was dirty and lesser, and did not belong. It was the cruelest thing the witch could think to do, to try to write her hatred into the very flesh of the girl, and make her carry it forever. Yet even a scar can be turned, in time, into a kind of banner. For the truth of that moment was not the word at all. The truth was the girl beneath it, who had been given every reason to break and had not broken, who had been offered pain and had answered with courage, and who lay at last upon the cold floor of that dark house still holding, unspoken and safe, everything she had chosen to protect. Up next in Chapter 16, A Freed Elf and the Grave Beside the Sea, we'll follow the friends into the depths of the cellar and the desperate hope that stirs there, where a small and faithful creature will answer a call no one expected, and a rescue bought at a terrible price will end on a windswept shore with a spade, a white beach, and a grave dug by grieving hands. The word was still raw upon her arm when the night turned at last toward mercy. Hermione lay upon the pale floor of the drawing room at Malfoy Manor, spent and shaking, the letters that Bellatrix Lestrange had cut into her skin burning like a brand, and above her the mad witch went on questioning her about a sword and a vault and a great many things Hermione could not have answered even had she wished to. It seemed, in that moment, that there could be no rescue, that the house of the Malfoys would be the end of the long wandering, and that all the reading and all the cleverness in the world would not be enough to save her now. Yet help was already close, closer than any of them knew, and it was coming from a small and unlikely quarter, from the very kind of creature that Hermione, alone among all her friends, had spent years learning to love. Down in the cellar beneath her, in the dark, the others were waiting. Ron Weasley and Harry Potter had been thrust down there with Luna Lovegood and Dean Thomas, with the old wandmaker Mr. Ollivander and the goblin Griphook, locked away below the very room in which Hermione was being questioned. Ron could hear her cries through the floorboards, and it was a torment worse than any curse. And in that black and hopeless place, Harry pressed a broken shard of enchanted mirror into his palm and saw within it, for a heartbeat, a flash of bright blue. An eye he half remembered, watching him from somewhere far away. He did not understand it then. But moments later there came a sharp crack in the dark, and a small figure stood trembling among them, thin and knock-kneed and enormous of eye, and it was Dobby. Dobby the house elf. Hermione had known him for years, this odd and gentle creature who had once served the Malfoys and been freed by a clever kindness of Harry's, who wore mismatched socks with a fierce and open pride, because socks, to a freed elf, were the very badge of his liberty. He was the one elf in all the world who took wages and asked for days of rest, the one who had gathered up every woolen hat that Hermione had ever knitted and hidden about the Gryffindor common room in her long and lonely campaign to set his people free. The other elves had been so offended by those hats that they would no longer clean the tower. Dobby alone had treasured them, and had done the work gladly, and had loved her for the caring behind it. And now, of all the creatures who might have come, it was he who had heard that Harry Potter needed him, and had answered by folding the very air apart to appear inside his old master's cellar. He worked quickly and without fear. He took Luna and Dean and old Mr. Ollivander each by the hand and turned upon the spot, and vanished with them into the night, carrying them away to a safe place beside the sea, and then he came back for the rest. Upstairs, meanwhile, the danger had sharpened toward its terrible height. Peter Pettigrew came down into the cellar and was overpowered in the struggle, and the silver hand his master had given him closed. in a strange final justice upon its own owner's throat. Harry and Ron burst up the stairs into the drawing room, where Bellatrix now held a curved silver knife against Hermione's neck, and all the household of the Malfoys stood ranged and watchful about them. There was a moment of held breath, of wands raised and threats traded across the bright cold room. And then, high above their heads, the great crystal chandelier began to tremble and to sing. For Dobby had returned, and with one small twist of his magic, he brought the whole shining weight of it crashing down. Bellatrix flung herself aside, and Hermione was dragged free of her grasp, and in the scramble and the falling glass, Harry seized the wands from Draco Malfoy's hand. Then, Dobby caught them all together, elf and boy and battered girl, and turned once more into the crushing dark of apparition, away from the manor and its horrors. But as they went, Bellatrix Lestrange hurled her silver knife after them into the closing air, the same cruel hand that had carved the word into Hermione's arm, sending its blade spinning through the last of the light. They landed upon a windswept beach beneath a wide gray sky, with a small stone house set back among the dunes, and the sea breaking endlessly along the shore. This was Shell Cottage, the home of Bill Weasley and his wife Fleur, a place of salt and safety at the very edge of the world. Hermione lay upon the cold damp sand, weak and bleeding and alive. They had escaped. And yet, even as the relief broke over them like the tide, they saw that not all of them had come away whole. Dobby stood swaying upon the sand, and in his small chest, buried to the very hilt, was Bellatrix's silver knife. The little elf sank slowly down. Harry gathered him up into his arms, and there upon the beach, with the sea wind in his great ears and his friends gathered close about him, Dobby the free elf slipped quietly out of the world. His last breath shaped the name of the boy he had loved best, and then his round eyes, which had always been so brimming and so full of feeling, grew still, and held nothing but the reflected gray of the sky. He had died as he had lived since the day of his freedom, unbought and unbowed, having given every last thing he possessed for a handful of people he had chosen, all on his own, to love. Hermione was carried up into the cottage, where Fleur bathed the wound upon her arm and tended the deeper hurt that Bellatrix's curse had left in her. And for a long while, she drifted in and out of a feverish, aching sleep, safe at last within warm walls. But when she woke, and was gently told, she wept as she had seldom wept in all her life. For Hermione Granger had spent her school years pleading the cause of the house elves when no other soul would listen, founding her small society for their welfare, stitching her hats by candlelight, insisting to anyone who would hear her that these were feeling creatures who deserved freedom and wages and simple gentleness. And here now was the proof of everything she had ever believed, lying still and cold in a house by the sea, an elf who had loved so freely and so bravely that he had crossed the whole of the country to die for his friends. It seemed to her a hard and holy thing that so small a being should have carried so vast a heart. Harry would not use magic to bury him, and Hermione understood him perfectly. He took a spade from the shed and dug the grave with his own 2 hands, in the hard soil of the garden above the sea, and the long labor of it, the blisters and the aching arms and the salt sweat, seemed to all of them the only fitting way to honor so faithful a heart. They wrapped Dobby carefully in one of Bill's own jackets and laid him down in the earth as though he were only sleeping, and closed his great gentle eyes. Luna knelt beside the grave and thanked him softly for all that he had done, and Harry took up a flat stone and scratched into it, slow and clumsy and sure. the words he most wished to leave behind, that here lay Dobby, a free elf. They stood together in the wind while the sea murmured far below, three friends who had lost so much and were about to risk a great deal more, and Hermione, leaning still upon the others for her strength, looked down at the small mound of turned earth and understood, more deeply than ever, that kindness offered even to the least and smallest of creatures is never wasted and is never truly buried. The days that followed at Shell Cottage were quiet ones, days of slow mending and low, careful talk beside the fire. But a plan was already forming among the three of them, for the goblin Griphook had come away to that same beach and now lay recovering under the same roof, and Griphook alone knew the innermost secrets of a certain deep and jealously guarded place. And there was a thing that Hermione and her friends now needed above all else, a thing that lay locked far beneath the earth in the oldest vault in all the wizarding world. Up next in Chapter 17, A Dragon Beneath the Bank, we'll uncover how Hermione braved the marble halls of Gringotts in a stolen disguise, and how a pale and captive dragon carried three weary friends up out of the dark and into the open sky. In the days that followed the digging of a small grave in the garden of the cottage by the sea, the little house filled with a quiet and steady purpose, and Hermione was at the heart of it. The salt wind came off the water and stirred the curtains, and inside those bright rooms the three friends turned their minds, at last, toward the thing they had been circling for so long. They had learned, in the strange and painful hours at the manor, and in the murmured talk that followed, that a piece of the enemy's torn soul lay hidden in the deepest vault of a bank, folded away among gold no one was meant to touch. It was a small golden cup that had once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff, engraved with a badger and fitted with two finely wrought handles, and it was kept in the vault of Bellatrix Lestrange, far below the marble halls of Gringotts. To reach it, they would need the help of a goblin named Griphook, who had come out of the manor with them and was mending slowly in a back bedroom, and Griphook would give his help for one price only, which was the silver sword of Godric Gryffindor. And so a plan was made, careful and frightening, and it asked of Hermione the hardest thing of all, for to walk into that bank and demand the opening of the Lestrange vault, someone would have to wear the face of Bellatrix herself, and that someone was Hermione. She, who still carried a cruel word cut into the soft skin of her forearm by Bellatrix's own hand, would have to become the very woman who had marked her. She did not flinch from it. She simply gathered what she needed, as she always had, and made ready. In a small flask she had kept a single dark hair, plucked from the robes she had worn out of the manor, and into a measure of thick, sluggish polyjuice potion she let it fall, and the brew turned a deep and ugly color. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The change came over her the way such changes do, swiftly and strangely, so that her friends had to look away from the sight of it. She grew taller, and her soft brown hair darkened and lengthened into heavy black waves, and her kind face lengthened and sharpened into the proud, heavy-lidded, handsome cruelty of Bellatrix Lestrange. Only her eyes, for those who knew to look, still held something of Hermione behind them, steady and frightened and brave. She stood in the borrowed body of her enemy and squared her shoulders and practiced the walk of a woman who had never in her life been told no. Beside her, Ron was disguised as well, made into a stranger with long hair and a full brown beard, so that not even his own mother would have known him. And Harry, with the goblin clinging to his back, drew the shimmering silver folds of the invisibility cloak over them both, and vanished from sight. They came into Diagon Alley in the gray light, and it was a sorrowful place now, boarded and shuttered and hung with fear. The bright shop windows were dark. Beggars huddled in doorways, and posters bearing frightened faces flapped upon the walls. Down the crooked, silent street the tall white bank rose as it always had, and up its marble steps the little company climbed, Hermione at the front with her chin lifted, playing the part of a woman everyone dreaded. Guards ran long golden probes across them, seeking hidden spells and disguises, and there were anxious moments, and a suspicious voice or two. But Hermione swept past every one of them with a cold impatience that no one dared to question, and Griphook whispered his guidance from beneath the cloak, and the gleaming inner doors opened before them. Down they went, in one of the small rattling carts that plunge into the roots of the earth, along tracks that dropped and twisted through the cold black passages far beneath the city. The air grew damp and ancient. And then, at a bend in the dark, a great silent waterfall came pouring down across the track, and the goblin cried a warning too late. It was the thief's downfall, and its water washed away all enchantment and all deceit. It broke over them in a cold rushing sheet, and where it touched Hermione the tall dark shape of Bellatrix melted clean away, and she was herself once more, small and soaked and shivering, her own brown hair plastered to her own frightened face. The cart tipped from the track, and the goblin's kindly hand and a gentle charm set them down softly upon the stone floor of the tunnel, drenched and no longer disguised, deep in the belly of the bank. Ahead of them, chained in the dark, waited the guardian of the deepest vaults. It was a dragon, and a more piteous creature Hermione had never seen. It was a Ukrainian ironbelly, huge and pale, its scales gone whitish and flaking in the sunless deep, and its eyes had turned a milky, wounded pink. For it had been kept so long in blackness that it had gone quite blind. The goblins had taught it to fear, striking small clanging instruments whenever it drew near, so that the poor beast had learned to shrink back at the very sound, believing pain would follow. Now it heard the clanking and cowered against the wall, and Hermione's kind heart ached at the sight of it, even in her fear. They slipped past it while it trembled, and Griphook laid his palm against the great door of the vault, and the wall melted away like smoke to let them in. But the treasure within was a trap of a bitter and clever kind. Every coin, every goblet, every crown heaped to the ceiling had been laid under 2 dark enchantments, so that whatever they touched burned white hot in their hands, and whatever they touched multiplied at once into a dozen scalding copies of itself. This was the Gemino curse, and the Flagrante curse woven together, and the moment their feet disturbed the hoard, the gold began to swell and pour and sear, filling the vault with a rising, glowing, burning tide. Somewhere high upon a shelf, catching the light, sat the little golden cup with its badger and its 2 fine handles, and Harry reached it at last with the blade of the borrowed sword and lifted it free, though it seared his skin as he closed his hand around it. And in that same moment the goblin took the sword that had been promised him and slipped away with it, and called out to the guards above that thieves had come, and left the 3 friends alone in the swelling furnace of the vault. Then came the moment that Hermione would remember all her life, when despair turned, in a single breath, into a wild and soaring hope. The guards were coming, and the burning gold was rising, and there seemed to be no way out at all. It was Harry who saw it, and Hermione who understood at once, and together they turned back toward the blind and cowering dragon. They loosed its heavy chains, and they scrambled up onto its broad pale back, and they urged it upward toward the faint far light and the cool clean air it had not felt in years. The great beast lifted its head. It seemed to sense that the clanking terror had gone, that nothing now stood between it and the open sky, and it began to climb. It smashed through the passage roof and through the vaults above, through iron and marble and stone, tearing up through the many floors of the bank while goblins and wizards fled screaming before it, until with a final tremendous heave it burst up through the grand marble hall of Gringotts and out through the roof into the daylight, and rose free above the rooftops of Diagon Alley, with 3 small figures clinging to its back and the whole of the ruined street falling away below. Up next in Chapter 18, Fangs, Fire, and the Falling of the Dark, we'll follow Hermione high above the countryside on the back of the great pale dragon, down at last into cold water and a long weary road, and into the growing shadow of a night when the enemy learns what has been stolen and the whole world begins to tremble toward war. In the last chapter we watched Hermione fall out of the sky on the back of a half-blind dragon, soaked and shaking, having broken into the deepest vault beneath Gringotts, and out again with a small golden cup clutched among their stolen things. Tonight the story gathers all its long threads together and carries her home, back to the castle where everything had begun, and though the night ahead is loud with battle, we will move through it slowly and softly, the way you might walk a familiar road in the dark. All of this happened a long time ago. Every person you have come to love in this tale is safe now, resting somewhere far beyond the noise, and nothing in it can reach the quiet room where you are lying. They had leapt from the dragon into a wide green lake and struggled to the bank, and there, dripping and gasping on the grass, Harry had felt the old burning wake in his scar and known that Voldemort had discovered their secret at last. The Dark Lord understood now that they were hunting the broken fragments of his soul, and in his fury Harry glimpsed the thing he had been chasing for so many months. That one last piece was hidden inside the school itself, deep within the great stone castle beneath the mountains. There was no more careful planning left to do. Hermione, who had spent a whole year measuring every single step before she took it, agreed quietly that they must simply go, and go at once. So they turned on the spot and vanished, and reappeared in the cold, dark lane of Hogsmeade, the little village below the school. At once a shrieking charm rose into the night like a great alarm, and the streets filled with cloaked figures and cruel lights, and it seemed they had walked straight into a trap with nowhere left to run. Then a door opened in a wall, and a rough old hand pulled them inside, and they found themselves in the dusty upstairs room of an inn, saved by a bearded barman with pale blue eyes they somehow knew. He was Aberforth, the younger brother of the great headmaster who had died the year before, and he had been watching over them through a fragment of enchanted mirror all along. He would have sent them away to safety if he could. But Hermione and her friends had come too far to turn back, and so at last he sighed and lifted a lamp, and behind a painting of a gentle young girl a hidden passage opened in the wall, a long tunnel that ran all the way up the hill and into the very heart of the school. They walked that passage for a long time, and when the far end swung open they climbed out into the room of requirement, that strange chamber which became whatever its user needed most. It had become a hiding place. All through the dark months of Hermione's absence, the students who had refused to bow had gathered there, and now the room was full of hammocks and worried faces and the warm smell of people who had waited a long time to fight back. When they saw who had come climbing through the tunnel, a great glad cry went up, and word raced out through secret ways to everyone who still believed. The old defenders came. The teachers rose. Down in the corridors, the professors began to raise the castle's ancient protections, stone guardians waking and marching, enchantments spreading over the walls like a shield of light, while the youngest children were hurried away down the tunnel to safety. But Hermione did not let herself be swept up in all of it. There was still the small golden cup, the twisted little Horcrux she had carried out of the vault, and it could not simply be smashed or melted or thrown away. It had to be destroyed by something rare and terrible, and there were very few such things left in the world. It was Hermione who remembered where one might still be found. 2 years before, while she lay frozen and helpless in the hospital wing, she had solved the riddle of the monster in the pipes, and she alone had understood that a great serpent lay dead now in the flooded dark beneath the castle, in the lost hall the founders had called the Chamber of Secrets. Its long fangs still held their venom. The entrance was hidden in an abandoned bathroom, sealed behind a stone sink, and it would open only to the hissing speech of serpents. Ron had heard that speech once, on the night the locket was destroyed, and now he closed his eyes and reached back into his memory and made the strange sliding sounds himself, and the sink slid away, and the black pipe yawned open before them. Down they went together, Hermione and Ron, into the deep and dripping dark, along the tunnel of old bones, and at last into the vast drowned chamber where the great serpent lay in ruin, pale and enormous and long since dead. Hermione bent and worked one of the curved fangs loose, and then gathered several more into her arms, for she was always careful, always thinking of what might be needed next. Then she set the golden cup upon the wet stone, and lifted the fang high, and drove it down. A dreadful shriek tore out of the little thing, a scream from the ruined soul trapped inside it, and a dark tide of water rose and crashed over them both, and when it fell away the cup lay still and harmless at last, only metal now, and nothing more. And there, in that cold and ancient place, with the fight beginning to shake the stones far above them, something small and long-awaited finally happened. Ron, catching his breath, spoke of the house elves in the kitchens and said that someone ought to tell them to flee, that they should not be left to die for a school that had never once thought of them. Hermione stood very still. For years she had carried the cause of those gentle overlooked creatures almost alone, and to hear Ron speak of them now, in the middle of everything, in the heart of the danger, undid something in her that all the peril of the year had not. She let the armful of fangs fall clattering to the floor, and crossed the space between them, and kissed him, and Ron kissed her back, and the two of them held on to each other as though the whole roaring world had gone quiet around them. When at last they climbed back up into the light, Harry was waiting, and he reminded them, with something close to weary wonder, that a war was being fought all around them. But nothing could quite spoil it. It had taken 7 long years, and it had come at the strangest possible moment, and it was theirs. Above them now, the castle had become a place of fire and thunder. The great protective enchantments were failing one by one, and through the gaps came the Dark Lord's army, giants that shook the towers with every step, and hooded wizards, and monstrous spiders pouring up out of the forest. Spells burst across the dark like colored lightning, and windows shattered into glittering rain, and whole stretches of ancient wall crumbled into rubble. Somewhere friends were falling. Hermione ran back into all of it at Ron's side, and Harry's side, the three of them together again, as they had always been, clutching the last of the basilisk fangs, weaving through smoke and falling stone toward the final pieces of the long hunt. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. But she had chosen this path when she was only 11, and she had never once let go of the people she loved, and she did not let go now. Up next in Chapter 19, The Castle That Would Not Fall. We'll follow Hermione through the longest night of her life, through loss and courage and the last great stand within those shaking walls, and see how a school full of ordinary brave hearts refused to be broken. By the time the little golden cup had been broken open in the flooded dark of the Chamber of Secrets, Hermione had already learned that some victories arrive without any brightness at all. In the last chapter, we watched the Room of Requirement fill with a fire that seemed to think and to hunt, and we watched Ron and Hermione go down beneath the castle to draw a poisoned fang from the bones of a long-dead serpent and turn it against the small dark Horcrux that held a splinter of Voldemort's ruined soul. Tonight we stay with her through the longest night of the whole war, and we let all of its fear stay gentle and far away, because every hour of it has been over for a great many years, and nothing that happened in it can reach the quiet room where you are resting now. The castle above them had already begun to tremble. When Hermione and Ron climbed back up out of the deep, the corridors they had known as children were no longer soft places of lamplight and moving stairs. Every teacher who could hold a wand had come to defend the school. Professor McGonagall had woken the suits of armor and the great stone statues and sent them marching down to guard the doors, and the enchantments laid over the walls glowed faintly against the night, a thin and shining shell of protection between the sleeping stones and the army gathered outside. Hermione took her place among the defenders without any fuss, the way she had done everything since she was 11, quietly and thoroughly, and long before anyone thought to ask her. There is a way of speaking about a battle that keeps it slow and holds it at a distance, and we will use it here. Curses crossed the corridors like slow lightning. Fine dust drifted down from the ceilings. Friends she had known for 7 years stood shoulder to shoulder in the ruined doorways, and she moved among them mending shields and calling out warnings, her mind working even here, steady as a clock, choosing each spell with the same care she had once given to a difficult essay. She was frightened, of course. Everyone was, but fear in Hermione had always been a thing she carried rather than a thing that carried her, and so she carried it now, down one broken hallway and up another, never once letting go of the 2 boys she loved. Not everyone would walk out of that night, and this is the part of the story we tell most softly of all. Somewhere in the thunder of a bursting wall, Fred Weasley, one of the 2 laughing twins who had filled the burrow with noise and smoke and kindness, was lost in a single bright instant, with his brother Percy beside him and Ron not far away. And in another part of the castle, Remus Lupin, the gentle werewolf who had taught them in his very first year to face the things they feared, and Nymphadora Tonks, who had married him and given him a small son only weeks before, fell as well, and were carried in and laid side by side in the great hall among the other fallen. The hall that had held so many warm feasts became, for one long stretch of the night, a place of grief. Hermione felt each of these losses the way one feels a stone dropped into deep water, the ache spreading slowly outward in rings. And still she did not stop, because stopping would not have brought them back, and there were others yet who needed protecting. There came a strange pause in the middle of it all. Voldemort, who wished to keep himself whole and to take Harry alive, drew his forces back for one single hour and let his cold voice fall over the grounds, offering the castle a rest that no one quite trusted. In that hour, the defenders gathered their wounded and counted their dead and breathed. Hermione stayed close to Ron and to Harry, and when Harry told them the last hard secret of the night, that he believed he must walk out into the forest alone and unarmed to meet the thing that had hunted him since, before he could remember, she did not argue the way a lesser friend might have done. She understood, as she had always understood, the hardest things first, and she held him for a moment, and then she let him go, which was perhaps the bravest thing she did in the whole of the war. Harry went down into the forest, and for a little while the castle believed him dead. That grief, too, passed over Hermione, and this chapter will not linger inside it, because morning was nearer than anyone yet knew. When Voldemort's people came marching back to the doors with their triumph held before them like a banner, the defenders did not surrender after all. The battle broke open one final time, out of the shattered entrance and into the great hall itself, and Hermione stood in the very thick of it with her wand held steady, fighting beside Ginny and Luna against Bellatrix Lestrange, the cruel witch who had once carved a word into her arm. She did not have to finish that duel herself. Molly Weasley, a mother who had lost a son only hours before, stepped into it with a fury none of them had ever seen in her, and it was Molly who ended Bellatrix at the last. And then the whole hall went suddenly still, because Harry was not dead after all. He stood revealed in the middle of the floor, alive and whole, and he and Voldemort began to circle one another beneath the enchanted ceiling, while everyone else drew back against the walls. Hermione watched from the edge of that circle, with Ron's hand in hers, holding her breath along with the entire silent room. What passed between the two of them was oddly quiet, almost like a lesson given in a calm classroom, Harry speaking plainly of wands and their loyalties, of a choice made on a cold tower months before, of a length of pale wood whose true allegiance had never once belonged to the Dark Lord at all. And when Voldemort raised that wand a final time and threw his killing curse across the floor, the wand refused him. The green light turned back upon the one who had cast it, and the most feared wizard of the age fell to the flagstones, an ordinary and empty body, and did not rise again. Outside, the sun was coming up. Light the color of pale gold moved slowly along the broken windows of the great hall and touched the faces of the living and the fallen alike, and the castle, which had been battered and burned and half thrown down through the long night, was still standing. It had not fallen. Hermione stood in that first quiet light among the people she loved most in the world, tired past all telling, grieving and grateful in the very same breath, and let herself understand, slowly, that the thing they had chased through forests and vaults and dungeons for a whole long year was truly finished. There would be a great deal to mourn in the days ahead, and a great deal to rebuild, stone by patient stone. But the shadow that had lain over her whole childhood had lifted at last with the dark, and it would never come again. Up next in Chapter 20, 19 Years and the Brightest Witch at Rest, we'll follow Hermione gently out of the war and into the long, bright peace that came after it, and see at last where the cleverest girl in her year finally laid all her burdens down. When the last curse had fallen silent, and the great hall lay open to the morning, Hermione Granger stood among the living and let herself understand, slowly, that the war was truly over. In the last chapter, we watched the castle refuse to fall, watched the darkest wizard of the age crumble in the dawn light, and the long night break at last into an ordinary gray. Tonight we follow her out of that morning and gently into all the quiet years that came after. And we let the story loosen as it goes, the way a long day softens toward evening. Because everything ahead of her now is peace. And peace is a kind and easy thing to fall asleep inside. She did not rush toward that peace. When many of her friends turned straight to work and to the rebuilding of a broken world, Hermione went back, of all places, to the castle. She returned to Hogwarts to finish the schooling the war had interrupted, to sit the examinations she had once dreamed about, and then set aside for a tent in the cold and a locket that weighed like grief. There was something fitting in it, that the girl who had loved learning above almost everything should choose, when at last she was free to choose anything, to go quietly back to her books. She walked halls that had been torn by battle and were being mended stone by stone, and she studied by lamplight in a library that had seen her grow, and she let ordinary lessons carry her, slowly, back toward an ordinary life. And Ron Weasley was never far. The friendship that had begun over a mountain troll in a first year long ago, that had bent and cooled and warmed again through every difficult season, had turned at last into something deeper and surer. Out there in the smoke and fire of the final night. It did not need declaring twice. In the years that followed, they married, the two of them, the loyal red-haired boy and the brilliant, tender-hearted witch, and it surprised no one who had watched them argue and forgive and stand back to back through every danger. Theirs was not a grand and thundering love. It was the quieter kind, worn smooth and comfortable as a favorite chair, the kind that knows exactly how the other takes their tea and never once needs to ask. In time there were children, and with them the house filled up with the small, ordinary noise that has nothing to do with wars. First came a daughter, Rose, bright and quick, with something of her mother in the tilt of her curiosity and something of her father in her easy laugh. Then came a son, Hugo, younger and softer, forever a step behind his sister, and forever trying to catch her up. Hermione, who had once memorized the whole of a spellbook on a train, now learned a gentler set of things by heart, the weight of a sleeping child against her shoulder. The particular hour each of them grew hungry, the stories they asked for over and over, until she knew them better than any lesson. She had spent her girlhood carrying great and dangerous knowledge, and she found, to her quiet joy, that this smaller knowledge was every bit as worth the keeping. Yet the girl who had campaigned for the freedom of house elves at 14 did not lay her convictions down simply because the fighting had stopped. Hermione took her sharp mind and her stubborn sense of fairness into the very heart of the Ministry of Magic, the place that had once seemed so cold and unjust to her, and she set about changing it from the inside. She began where her heart had always been, working for the creatures the wizarding world had long overlooked, pressing for the rights and dignity of house elves, chipping patiently away at old cruel laws that had stood unquestioned for centuries. The badge she had once pinned on hopeful and been laughed at for, the small cause of the forgotten, grew in her hands into real and lasting change, written into the law of the land where no one could laugh it away again. From there, she rose into the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, into the difficult and necessary work of building a fairer justice out of the wreckage the war had left behind. She knew, better than most, what it was to be judged unfairly, to be marked with an ugly word for the blood in her veins, and she carried that memory into every ruling and every reform. She worked to root out the old poisons of prejudice, the belief that some kinds of magic and some kinds of people mattered more than others, the belief that had very nearly torn the world apart. She did it not with grand speeches, but with long hours and careful paperwork, and a patience that never seemed to run dry. The same patience that had once copied out case after case by hand to save a single hippogriff on a gray afternoon. And so the years gathered, one gentle upon another, until 19 of them had passed since the morning the castle stood. On the 1st of September, in that far-off autumn, Hermione came at last to a place she had first seen as a nervous 11-year-old with a trolley and too many books. King's Cross Station, and the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, and beyond it the hidden platform 9 3/4, wreathed in the white steam of the scarlet Hogwarts Express. She walked through the solid-seeming wall the way she had learned to long ago, and on the far side she was not a frightened child, but a mother. With her husband beside her, and her own children at her hands, it was Rose who was leaving that day, off to the castle for the very first time, her trunk loaded and her face torn between excitement and fear, exactly as her mother's had once been. Hugo stood watching, still too young to go, aching with the unfairness of having to wait his turn. All around them, the platform held the people the long story had carried them to. Harry was there, and Ginny, with children of their own, one of them a boy about to begin his own first year alongside Rose. The friends who had been children together in a great stone castle now stood grown on a smoking platform, watching a new generation climb aboard the same red train, and the sight of it was so ordinary and so extraordinary all at once that it seemed to hold the whole long tale gently in its hands. Hermione smoothed her daughter's hair and straightened her collar and let her go, the way every parent must, and the train pulled away north, with the children waving from its windows until it was only a red smudge on the far horizon. Her own road still climbed. In the years beyond that platform, the brightest witch of her age rose higher still within the ministry she had spent her life mending, until she came to stand at the very top of it, as Minister for Magic, the highest office the wizarding world could offer. The Muggle-born girl who had once been called an unforgivable name now guided the whole of magical Britain with a steady and fair hand, and did it not out of hunger for power, which she had never wanted, but out of the same simple wish that had driven her all along, the wish to leave the world a little kinder and a little more just than she had found it. She had earned her place not by luck and not by birth, but by every hard-won hour of study and courage and stubborn decency, and the world was better for having handed it to her. And that, dear listener, is where we may let her rest, not in the smoke of any battle, not in the cold of any wandering, but in the quiet of a life well made, with a good man beside her and children grown, a great work done, and a fair world tended. The frightened girl on the train became the bravest of friends, and the bravest of friends became the wisest of women, and all of it, every book and every fear and every act of quiet courage, settled at last into peace. Let the story close there, softly, as a book closes when the reading is done. There is nothing more she needs from us now, and nothing more we need to carry. In the still calm after everything, we can simply let her rest. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed a Muggle girl and a letter she could not explain, the girl who read the whole way to the castle, the mountain troll and the first brave lie, the petrified halls and the potion brewed in secret, and the turner of time that folded too many hours into one. We watched a hippogriff and a rat and a knight that bent, the ball where a quieter courage showed itself, the badge she wore for the forgotten, and the army gathered in a hidden room. We stood in the hall of prophecy, and in the long wandering in the cold, we saw the locket's weight and the empty chair, the serpent in the snow at Godric's Hollow, and the word carved cruelly into her arm. We watched a freed elf and a grave beside the sea, a dragon beneath the bank, and fang and fire and the falling of the dark, until the castle stood, and the years turned gently, and the brightest witch came at last to rest. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.